Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep to, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. The year was 2009. I was 24, fresh out of college, and looking for a break from the chaos of city life. I had spent the last few years juggling school, internships, and a job that barely paid rent. When my uncle offered me a place to stay for the summer at his lighthouse on the coast of Maine, I took it without hesitation. The idea of living by the ocean, surrounded by nothing but crashing waves and salty air, sounded like the kind of peace I desperately needed. The lighthouse had been in my uncle's possession for years, though he rarely stayed there himself. It was old, built in the late 1800s, and sat on a rocky cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The nearest town was about 40 minutes away by car, and the only way in or out was a single winding road that cut through dense pine trees. It wasn't just isolated, it felt like a different world entirely. I arrived in early June, just as the summer air had begun to warm. The drive up was long, the road twisting through thick forest, before suddenly opening to a view of the vast ocean. The lighthouse stood tall and weathered, its red and white paint chipped away by years of wind and salt. Beside it, a small keeper's house sat, barely visible beneath the shadows of the towering structure. This would be my home for the next few months. When I first stepped inside, the place smelled of damp wood and old books. Dust coated the wooden floors, and the furniture was minimal. A single worn-out couch, a wooden dining table, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a bedroom upstairs with a narrow bed and a dresser, both of which looked like they had been there for decades. The walls were lined with old nautical maps, yellowed and curling at the edges, and shelves stacked with faded journals. My uncle had left a note on the table. "Glad you made it. The place is rough around the edges, but it's sturdy. Generators in the back, water pump still working, and there's a pantry full of canned food. Stay out of the lighthouse at night. Signal gets weak out here, but it'll check in when I can. Enjoy the quiet." I remember raising an eyebrow at that last part. Stay out of the lighthouse at night? It struck me as an odd warning, but I figured it had to do with safety. Maybe the stairs were unstable, or the old wiring wasn't reliable. Either way, I didn't question it too much. The first few days were uneventful. I fell into a simple routine, waking up early, making coffee, and sitting outside on the back porch, watching the waves roll in. The air smelled of salt and pine, and the only sounds were the distant cries of seagulls and the rhythmic crash of the tide. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. In the afternoons, I walked along the rocky shore, exploring tide pools and collecting smooth stones. There were no neighbors, no passing cars, no city noises. Just the ocean, the lighthouse, and me. I spent my evenings reading through some of the old journals I found on the shelves. Most of them belonged to past keepers, detailing their daily routines, maintenance logs, and the occasional personal entry about storms or long winters spent alone. One entry, dated 1952, caught my attention. It was brief, written in shaky handwriting. "The light was off again last night. I swore I lit it before bed. Must be the wind." I thought nothing of it at first. The lighthouse was old, and mechanical failures were probably common back then. I moved on, flipping through more pages, filled with the monotonous details of life at the lighthouse. The same chores, the same complaints about the cold, the same longing for company. By the end of the first week, I had settled into the solitude. The only time I felt uneasy was at night. The wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls, making the whole house groan. The generator wasn't the most reliable, and sometimes the power flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. The lighthouse loomed just outside my window, its beams sweeping across the dark water. Every now and then, I caught myself staring at it, feeling watched. Of course, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I had spent years surrounded by the constant noise of the city, sirens, voices, traffic. Now, in the dead silence of the coast, my brain was just trying to fill in the gaps. Then, one night, something happened that made me question everything. That night, the wind was stronger than usual. The old wooden house creaked, and the trees outside bent under the force of the gusts rolling in from the ocean. I sat at the small kitchen table, reading one of the old lighthouse journals by the dim glow of a single oil lamp. The generator had been acting up again, and the power had flickered out earlier, forcing me to rely on the lamp's weak light. Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its slow, rhythmic rotation, cutting through the darkness. Every time it swept past my window, shadows stretched and shifted across the walls. I had grown used to the effect, but something about it felt different that night. Then, it happened. A loud thud echoed from the direction of the lighthouse. It was a deep, solid sound, like something heavy had fallen. I froze, my pulse spiking. It wasn't the wind. This was deliberate, like something had struck the side of the structure. I set the journal down and stood up slowly, listening. The house groaned with the storm, but beneath it, I could swear I heard something else, a faint, dragging sound. I moved to the window, peering out. The lighthouse stood tall against the stormy night, its red and white exterior faintly illuminated by its own rotating beam. Nothing looked out of place. The door at its base was shut, the rocky path leading up to it empty. I told myself it was probably just debris, maybe a loose piece of wood or an old rusted tool knocked over by the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and hesitated for a moment before stepping outside. The wind hit me instantly, cold and sharp, cutting through my thin sweater. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the distant roar of waves crashing against the cliffs filled the silence between each gust. I walked cautiously toward the lighthouse, my boots crunching over the gravel path. The beam of my flashlight swept across the ground, illuminating patches of wet stone and tangled seaweed that had blown in from the shore. I reached the base of the lighthouse and ran my fingers along the door handle, cold, rusted, and locked, just as I had left it earlier that day. I exhaled, feeling a little ridiculous for getting worked up over nothing. It was probably an old shutter slamming in the wind, or maybe something dislodged by the storm. Just as I was about to turn back, the lighthouse beam swung around again, and in that brief moment of light, I saw it. A single footprint in the damp gravel. I stopped breathing. It wasn't mine. I had walked up from the house, and my tracks were behind me. But this one, it was fresh, partially filled with rainwater, and facing the lighthouse door. I turned my flashlight toward the ground, scanning the area, but the rest of the gravel was undisturbed. No trail leading in or out. Just that one footprint, like someone had stood there and vanished. A cold chill ran down my spine. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step back. Maybe it had been there earlier, and I hadn't noticed. Maybe I had stepped in the same spot twice, overlapping my own print without realizing it. I shook my head, brushing off the thought, and hurried back to the house. As soon as I stepped inside, I locked the door behind me, heart still pounding. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old wooden frame, every gust of wind scraping against the windows, made me jolt awake. I kept replaying the image of that single footprint in my mind, trying to rationalize it. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just my imagination. The storm had passed, leaving behind damp earth and a sea of gray fog rolling in from the cliffs. I forced myself into a routine, cleaning up the kitchen, making coffee, and sitting outside on the porch, staring at the lighthouse as if it might offer some kind of answer. For the next couple of days, nothing unusual happened. The sense of unease lingered, but I ignored it, keeping busy with small tasks around the house. The old journals continued to fascinate me, and I spent my nights reading through them, finding comfort in the mundane accounts of past keepers who had lived here before me. Then, on the fourth night, something even stranger happened. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a low, distant knocking sound. Not from the house, from the lighthouse. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The wind outside was calm. No storm, no heavy gusts to blame this time. Just stillness. I grabbed my flashlight again, hesitating before stepping to the window. The lighthouse stood as it always had, its rotating beam cutting through the darkness. But this time, I wasn't imagining it. The door was open. Not swinging in the wind, not slightly ajar. Wide open. I knew I had locked it. I was certain. I stood there, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. Every instinct in my body told me to stay inside, to lock my own door, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But something about that open doorway called to me. I needed to know. I pulled on my jacket, forcing myself to move despite the way my hands shook. As I stepped outside, the air was still. The ocean, usually loud with crashing waves, sounded quieter, muted. I approached the lighthouse, my pulse thudding in my ears. The door creaked slightly in the breeze, swinging just enough to reveal the dark interior. I swallowed hard and shined my flashlight inside. Nothing. The spiral staircase wound up into the darkness, the walls lined with old equipment and rusted pipes. The smell of oil and damp stone filled my nose. I took a step inside, then another. The air was thick, heavy in a way that made my skin prickle. My flashlight flickered slightly as I reached the bottom of the stairs. I pointed it upward, half expecting to see something, someone, standing at the top. But there was nothing. The silence was unbearable. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, something shifted above me, a soft, scraping sound, like the brush of fabric against stone. I held my breath. The flashlight flickered again. And then, a single, heavy footstep echoed from the top of the stairs. I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't breathe until I was back inside the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. My hands trembled as I pressed my back against the wood, heart racing. For hours, I sat there in silence, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I listened, waiting for another knock, another sound, anything. But nothing came. The next morning, the lighthouse door was shut again, locked, like nothing had ever happened. The night had started, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and rain. A storm had rolled in from the east, thick clouds smothering the stars. The waves were louder than usual, crashing against the cliffs in a rhythmic assault. I had been inside, half asleep on the couch, when the first sound broke through the noise of the storm, faint, distant, and out of place. It was a soft tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling a loose shutter, or maybe rain against the window. I ignored it, but a few minutes later, it came again. Rhythmic, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, groggy and disoriented. The dim glow of the lantern I had left on barely reached the far corners of the room. My eyes flicked to the window, but all I could see was the distorted reflection of the room against the dark glass. The tapping stopped. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. It's nothing. Just my mind playing tricks. The wind, the storm, anything but something I needed to worry about. I stood up, stretched, and checked the time. A little after 2 in the morning. The storm outside had strengthened, and I could hear the rain now, steady against the roof. I turned toward the hallway, ready to head upstairs, when it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it wasn't the window. It was the front door. I froze. The house was miles away from anything. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive, and no one ever came out here unannounced. The road leading up to the lighthouse was barely drivable at night, let alone during a storm. And even if someone had made the trip, Who knocks at a stranger's door at 2 in the morning? The tapping stopped again. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every logical explanation vanished. Maybe an animal? A loose branch? I didn't move. Then, against all better judgment, I stepped closer to the door. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, and as I reached for the handle, a gust of wind rattled the walls. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone. But my curiosity, or maybe my stupidity, won. I cracked the door open just an inch. The cold air rushed in, bringing with it the sharp scent of rain and salt. I peered out into the darkness, my eyes adjusting to the night. Nothing. The porch was empty. The storm howled through the trees beyond the lighthouse, bending their skeletal forms in the wind. My gaze flickered toward the lighthouse itself. The beam swept across the ocean, steady and unchanging. Still, something felt wrong. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the area. The rain made it hard to see, but the gravel path leading to the lighthouse was undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of movement, nothing at all. I exhaled sharply, telling myself it had been the winds or some loose debris. I turned back to go inside. Then I saw them. Faint, barely visible against the wet wood of the porch. 3 small, damp handprints. My breath hitched. They weren't mine, and they were too small for an adult. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, making me jump. My pulse pounded against my skull as I turned, scrambling to push the door back open. I rushed inside, locking it behind me. My chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven breaths. I backed away from the door, staring at it like something might come crashing through at any second. But nothing happened. The house was silent again, except for the rain and the steady hum of the generator. I tried to calm myself down. It's just the storm. The wind blew something against the porch. The prints? Probably my own from earlier, distorted by the rain. I'm just tired. But even as I told myself these things, I didn't believe them. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the glass, made me jolt upright, listening. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was a washed-out shade of gray, the ocean calmer, but still restless. I stepped outside, half expecting to see those handprints again. But the rain had washed them away. The rational part of me wanted to move on, to forget about it. But a small, nagging voice in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. I wasn't alone out here. I just didn't know what was out there with me. The night it all came to a head, the air felt wrong. I had grown used to the loneliness of the lighthouse, to the relentless crash of the waves, the howling wind, and the way the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the beam's slow, rhythmic rotation. But this night was different. The air was too still. The wind had died, the waves had quieted, and an unnatural silence hung over everything, pressing in like an unseen force. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old lighthouse logbooks I had been reading for weeks. Pages filled with mundane reports from keepers long before me, weather conditions, ship movements, maintenance notes. But among them, I had found something else. Strange entries. One in particular kept circling in my mind, an entry dated exactly 50 years ago to the day. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if the writer had been in a rush to get the words down before something interrupted him. The knocking again. 3 times. Always 3. I don't answer anymore. It's better that way, but I fear that waiting will only make it worse. The next entry, written the following night, was brief. It's inside now. That was the last entry. There were no records of the keeper who had written it. No name. No indication of what happened to him. The logbook ended there. My fingers tightened around the pages. For weeks, I had felt something creeping just beyond the edges of my vision. The tapping on the door. The faint, deliberate footprints in the damp gravel. The whisper of movement inside the lighthouse when I knew I was the only one there. I had brushed it off, told myself it was nothing, but deep down, I had known. Something was here, and tonight, I was going to face it. The first sound came just after midnight. Not a knock this time. Not the soft tapping I had grown used to. This was different. A deep, resonant boom against the lighthouse door. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room seemed to shrink around me, the silence stretching unbearably between each breath. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the wooden porch groaning beneath my weight. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its beam cutting through the heavy fog that had rolled in off the ocean. The door stood closed, but I knew what I had heard. As I moved closer, the air grew colder. The dampness clung to my skin, and the scent of salt grew stronger, more pungent. I reached the door, hesitating for just a second before pressing my palm against the wood. It was warm. Despite the cold night air, the door radiated heat, like something inside was burning just beneath the surface. My breath caught in my throat. Then, as if answering my touch, the door swung open. Not slowly, not with a wind. It was yanked open, hard and fast, revealing only darkness beyond the threshold. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The stairs leading upward were barely visible, swallowed by the void. My pulse pounded, screaming at me to turn back, to run, to not go inside. But something else pulled me forward. The same morbid curiosity that had kept me searching through those old journals. The same unanswered questions that had haunted me since the first night I had heard the knocking. I stepped inside. The air was thick, stifling. The beam of my flashlight barely cut through the darkness, revealing only fragments of the space around me. The worn wooden steps spiraling upward, the rusted lanterns hanging from the walls, the heavy machinery that had kept the lighthouse alive for decades. And then, movement. Something shifted in the darkness above me. A breath, a whisper of motion. I froze, my chest tightening. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice hollow, swallowed by the oppressive silence. No answer, but the air felt heavier now, like something unseen was pressing against my skin. I forced my feet forward, climbing the stairs one at a time, each creaking step echoing in the suffocating stillness. My flashlight flickered as I reached the first landing, and I could see the large, rusted door that led to the maintenance room. It was ajar. A sliver of darkness peered through the gap, and as I reached for it, the door slammed shut. I stumbled back, a strangled gasp catching in my throat. The echo of the impact rang through the tower, and then silence. A deep, unnatural silence. My flashlight flickered again, and for the briefest moment, in that split second of darkness, I saw it. A shape standing at the top of the stairs. Not fully formed, not entirely there, but a presence nonetheless. It wasn't human. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its form shifting like mist trying to hold a shape. It had no face, but I could feel its eyes locked on me, boring into me with an intensity that sent a violent shiver down my spine. And then, in the same way it had appeared, it was gone. The flashlight steadied. The stairs were empty, but I wasn't alone. The pressure in the air grew unbearable, a force pushing against my chest, suffocating. My legs locked in place, every muscle screaming at me to move, to run. Then, from the silence, 3 knocks. Not at the door. Not from outside. From inside the walls. I staggered back, my breath ragged. The entire tower groaned, the wood creaking under an unseen force. The sound of knocking grew louder, spreading, beneath my feet, above my head, around me, as if the very walls of the lighthouse were alive with it. The presence was everywhere. Then, a whisper. Soft, barely audible, yet deafening in the silence. "It's inside now." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were in me, rattling in my skull, reverberating through my bones. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My vision blurred as the walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in. Then, the final sound. A single, heavy footstep. Right behind me. I turned. Darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up on the ground outside. The lighthouse door was shut, locked. The sky had begun to lighten, a faint glow of dawn breaking against the horizon. My body ached, my mind reeling. The last thing I remembered was that voice, those words. "It's inside now." I stumbled to my feet, staring at the lighthouse. The beam continued its steady rotation, cutting through the mist as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I wasn't sure how I had gotten outside. I wasn't sure how long I had been unconscious. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something was in that lighthouse, and it wasn't leaving. The morning after that night was colder than usual. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a soft gray, the ocean calmer but restless, as if something beneath the waves was stirring. I stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the lighthouse, its white walls streaked with moisture from the storm. The rotating beam moved with its steady rhythm, unchanged, indifferent. If anyone had seen it from the sea, they wouldn't have known that inside those walls, something unnatural had made its home. I was alive. That should have meant something. But it didn't feel like a victory. I didn't remember how I had gotten outside. My last memory was the presence, that thing, standing behind me, its weight pressing against my very being. The suffocating darkness. The 3 knocks from inside the walls. And then, nothing. No struggle. No chase. Just the feeling of time slipping away. I checked the lighthouse door. Still locked. My keys were still in my pocket, just as I had left them the night before. I hesitated for a long time before unlocking it, my fingers trembling as I turned the handle. The door swung open with a reluctant groan. The air inside was thick, unnaturally still. Everything was exactly as it had been the previous night. The stairs wound up into the shadows. The maintenance door stood slightly ajar, and the dust in the corners remained undisturbed. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had changed. The lighthouse didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt occupied. I stepped inside, my boots echoing against the wooden floor. My own breathing felt too loud, unnatural against the suffocating silence. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, but I needed answers. I climbed the stairs, one careful step at a time, expecting something, anything, to lurch out from the shadows. But nothing did. I reached the top, where the massive light spun on its axis, bathing the ocean in its glow. The machinery hummed, the gears turning as they always had. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. A presence. Unseen, but undeniable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, watching. I swallowed hard, forcing my hands to stay steady. I had a choice. I could leave, pack my things, drive away, and never look back. Pretend this place was just another old lighthouse with creaky stairs and a lonely keeper. Convince myself that I had imagined it all. Or I could stay and acknowledge the truth. This lighthouse wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to something else. I lasted another week. At first, I tried to act as though nothing had changed. I did my daily rounds, maintained the equipment, logged my reports. But the silence inside the lighthouse wasn't the silence of an empty place anymore. It was the silence of something waiting. The knocks returned. Not every night. Not always in the same place, but always 3. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the door, sometimes right beside me when I knew I was alone. The whisper came next. I would wake in the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, to the sound of something breathing. Not loud, not aggressive, just there, close, too close. Then the voice, soft and deliberate. whispering the same words I had read in that old logbook. It's inside now. By the seventh day, I couldn't do it anymore. I packed my things, left my final report on the desk, and locked the door behind me. As I walked down the rocky path to my truck, I felt it. The weight of unseen eyes pressing against my back, watching. I didn't turn around. I drove for hours, following the winding coastal roads until the lighthouse was far behind me, a distant speck on the horizon. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What would I even say? That a place had claimed me? That I had stood in the presence of something I couldn't explain and barely survived? No one would believe me. So I stayed quiet. Months passed. I found work at another lighthouse, further south, where the coastline was different and the air didn't feel heavy with unspoken things. It was a good job. Simple. Normal. But I wasn't the same. I still woke up some nights, expecting to hear those 3 knocks against the walls. Sometimes I did. A phantom sound, half dream, half memory, but real enough to make my skin crawl. I stopped sleeping near doors. Stopped leaving windows open. And no matter where I was, I avoided looking at the ocean for too long, because sometimes, just at the edge of my vision, I could swear I saw the faint glow of a distant beam. Rotating. Waiting. The lighthouse still stands. And I know, deep down, I never really left. Time moved on, but the lighthouse never truly left me. No matter how many miles I put between myself and that lonely stretch of coastline, it lingered in my mind like an unfinished sentence, a door left slightly ajar. Some nights I dreamed of it, its towering silhouette against the stormy sky, the rhythmic rotation of its light cutting through the darkness. But the dreams were never just about the lighthouse itself. Something was always inside, standing at the top of the stairs, waiting. I never told anyone the full story. When people asked why I left, I stuck to the easy version, claimed the isolation had gotten to me, that I wanted a fresh start. It was an answer people could accept. But the truth stayed buried inside me, growing heavier with each passing year. I never dared to look up old reports about the place, never checked if another keeper had taken my place. The thought of someone else living inside those walls, feeling that same suffocating presence creeping up behind them, was too much. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I wondered, did they hear the knocks? Did they see the shadow? Did they wake to whispers in the dark, speaking words they should not understand? Or had the lighthouse fallen silent again, content now that it had already taken what it needed? I never went back. Not once. But the lighthouse didn't need me to return. It found ways to remind me that I still belonged to it. It was in the way shadows stretched a little too long in empty hallways. The way an unexplained draft would move through a locked room. The way my breath sometimes caught in my throat for no reason at all, like something unseen was standing just a little too close. And of course, the knocks. Always 3. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The lighthouse hadn't let me go. It never would. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what it had wanted all along. I never thought I'd be the type of person to experience something that couldn't be explained. I've always been a logical guy, the kind who looks for the most rational explanation before jumping to conclusions. But some things can't be explained. Some things are just wrong. And I learned that the hard way. It started about 10 years ago when I was in my early 20s. Back then, I had just gotten a job as a night security guard at an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place people went to anymore. Most of the windows were either shattered or boarded up, the walls were covered in graffiti, and the air always smelled of damp concrete and decay. The building had been shut down for years after the funding was cut, and the only reason my job existed was to keep trespassers from breaking in. I wasn't alone in this. There were 3 of us working shifts, me, an older guy named Tom, and a quiet, reserved man named Luis. We rotated schedules, but most of the time, I ended up working the late shift. Midnight to 6 in the morning. 6 hours of walking empty hallways, staring at flickering monitors, and listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. It was boring work, but it paid well, and I figured it would be easy. My job was simple: make rounds every hour, check the security cameras, and call the police if anyone broke in. But here's the thing, no one ever broke in. The hospital had been abandoned for over a decade, and most people stayed away. There were rumors, of course. Locals like to say the place was haunted, that strange things happened there. Ghost stories, urban legends, the kind of nonsense people make up when a place is left to rot. I didn't believe any of it. At least, not at first. The hospital was massive, 4 floors, a basement, and a rooftop parking lot that had long since become a nesting ground for pigeons. The inside was worse. Most of the equipment had been stripped out, but there were still signs of what the building used to be. Old hospital beds lined the hallways, covered in dust and debris. Broken wheelchairs were scattered near the entrances, their wheels frozen in place. Some rooms still had gurneys in them, their sheets stained yellow with time. And everywhere, there were papers. Stacks of patient files, reports, records. Some were crumpled on the floor, others still clung to the desks, their edges curling from years of neglect. I'd seen abandoned buildings before, but there was something different about this place. It didn't just feel empty, it felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. And at night, when the wind blew through the broken windows, it almost sounded like whispers. But I ignored it. I had a job to do, and I wasn't about to let a bunch of old ghost stories mess with my head. At first, everything was normal. My nights followed the same routine. Show up at 11:45, sign in, grab my flashlight, and start my rounds. I'd walk the halls, check the doors, make sure no one had broken in. The hospital had no electricity, except for a small generator that powered a few security cameras and the front desk. That meant most of my patrols were done in complete darkness, with only my flashlight to guide me. The place was a maze. Hallways twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, and half the doors were either stuck shut or missing completely. The emergency stairwells were filled with debris, and the elevators, long out of service, stood open like gaping mouths. The worst part was the surgical wing. Something about that area always made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the operating tables, still bolted to the floor. Or maybe it was the dried stains on the walls, too faded to tell if they were rust. Or something else. But I never let it get to me. Tom used to tell me I was lucky. "You've got the easy shift," he'd say. "Just keep your head down, do your rounds, and don't let the dark mess with you." He never elaborated on that last part. Tom had been working at the hospital for years. He was in his 50s, grizzled and tired, the kind of guy who'd seen too much and didn't care to talk about it. He worked the evening shifts and always made sure he was gone before midnight. I asked him once why he never took the late shift. He just shook his head. "Not my kind of hours," he said. "Place gets different at night." Luis, on the other hand, was quiet. He was younger than Tom, maybe in his late 30s, but he carried himself like someone who had seen too much. He never spoke unless he had to, and when he did, his words were short and clipped. He worked the early morning shift, coming in just as I was getting ready to leave. The first few weeks were uneventful. He'd show up, do my rounds, check the cameras, and wait for morning. The most excitement I got was chasing off the occasional raccoon that managed to sneak inside. But then things started happening. It started small. One night, I found a door open that I was sure had been closed. It was in the pediatric wing, a part of the hospital I rarely had to check. The door was heavy, one of those thick wooden ones with a metal handle. I remembered shutting it during my first round, making sure it latched. But when I passed by again an hour later, it was wide open. I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. So I shut it again, made sure it latched, and continued my rounds. The next night, it was open again. This time, I checked the hinges, the latch, everything. Nothing was broken, no signs of forced entry. I shut it, pulled on it to make sure it was secure, and walked away. By the third night, I started feeling uneasy. When I found the door open again, I felt something I hadn't felt before, something I didn't want to admit. I wasn't alone. I told Tom about it the next evening. He didn't look surprised. "Yeah," he said, rubbing his jaw. "That happens sometimes." "What do you mean, that happens sometimes?" I asked. Tom sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Look, man, you do this job long enough, you start seeing things that don't make sense. Best thing you can do is ignore it." Luis didn't say anything when I mentioned it to him. He just stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. I should have left it alone. I should have ignored it, like Tom said. But I didn't, and that was my mistake. Because whatever was in that hospital, it knew I had noticed it, and it was just getting started. I should have ignored it. That's what I keep telling myself when I look back on that night. If I had just let it go, if I had listened to Tom and minded my own business, maybe none of this would have happened. But curiosity has a way of pulling you into things you're better off leaving alone. And once you start paying attention to something, it starts paying attention to you. It was a Thursday night, about halfway through my shift. The hospital was dead silent, as always. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old building settling, the wind pushing against the shattered windows, and the soft hum of the security monitors at the front desk. I was making my usual rounds, flashlight in hand, moving through the darkened hallways. The pediatric wing was my last stop, and by that point, I already felt uneasy. I knew what I would find. The door. The same one that had been opening by itself for the past 3 nights. Sure enough, when I turned the corner, it was open again. A gaping, black rectangle in the middle of the hallway. I stopped a few feet away, my pulse kicking up. This time, I knew for a fact I had shut it. I had pulled on it, checked the latch, even given it an extra push just to be sure. There was no reason for it to be open now. The air felt different in that hallway, thicker, like I had stepped into a place I wasn't supposed to be. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it toward the doorway, the weak beam struggling against the darkness inside. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step forward. Then another. A few more steps, and I was right at the threshold, peering into the empty room beyond. It was one of the old patient rooms, mostly stripped bare, except for an abandoned hospital bed pushed up against the wall. The mattress was missing, leaving only the rusted metal frame behind. A few scattered papers littered the floor, their edges curling from age. I took a breath and stepped inside. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, my flashlight cut out. Total darkness swallowed the room. I froze. I gave the flashlight a shake, smacked it against my palm, but it refused to turn back on. My breath sounded too loud in the silence, my pulse hammering in my ears. Something about the air in the room had changed. It felt heavier, pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I knew something else was in that room with me. I turned toward the doorway, about to step back into the hallway, and then I heard it. A faint shuffling sound, somewhere in the darkness. Not the sound of wind, not the settling of the building. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. A cold wave of fear shot through me. My fingers fumbled over the flashlight, trying to switch it back on, but the button wouldn't click. My hands were shaking now, my breathing coming in short gasps. The footsteps stopped. Then, tap. A single, sharp sound, like a fingernail tapping against metal. It came from the direction of the old hospital bed. I gritted my teeth, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But I couldn't move. I felt like a deer caught in headlights, trapped in the dark with something I couldn't see. And then, tap, tap. Louder this time. Closer. Right next to me. I yanked my radio from my belt and pressed the call button. Tom, I hissed. Tom, are you there? Static. Nothing but static. I backed up toward the doorway, heart hammering against my ribs. My flashlight flickered once, just long enough to give me a glimpse of the room, of the bed, of the figure standing next to it. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. Something real, something standing right there. And then the light went out again. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. I ran straight out of the pediatric wing, down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the security desk. My hands were shaking as I slammed my flashlight onto the desk, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Tom looked up from his seat, brow furrowed. What the hell's wrong with you? I couldn't even speak. My throat was dry, my chest tight with fear. He stood up, giving me a once-over. You look like you just saw a ghost. I gritted my teeth, forcing my voice to work. The pediatric wing. That damn door was open again. I went in and I stopped, shaking my head. There was something in there. Tom's face darkened. You saw it. I blinked. What? His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine. You saw something. I swallowed hard. I don't know what I saw, but I know it wasn't. I stopped myself. I didn't want to say the word. Saying it would make it real. Tom didn't press me. He just sighed and sat back down. I told you not to pay attention. I stared at him. What the hell does that mean? He didn't answer. The next morning, Luis arrived just as I was getting ready to leave. He took one look at me and frowned. You saw it. That was the second time I had heard those words in the past few hours. I ran a hand through my hair, exhausted. What the hell is going on in this place, man? Luis hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, It knows when you notice it. A chill ran down my spine. Luis glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. Don't talk about it. Don't acknowledge it. If you do, he exhaled sharply. It gets worse. I opened my mouth to press him for more, but he was already walking away. I barely slept that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that dark hospital room. The bed. The thing standing beside it. By the time my next shift rolled around, I had made up my mind. I wasn't going back into that room. I was going to stick to my rounds, keep my head down, and pretend like nothing had happened. But it was too late. Because once you see it, it sees you too. The days that followed were a blur of unease. The hospital felt different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. No matter how many times I walked through the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was constantly watching, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known again. At night, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, checking corners, and making sure nothing was just out of sight. I had heard stories from the other staff members about odd things happening here, strange noises, objects moving on their own, patients speaking to people who weren't there. But I had always dismissed them as coincidence or the product of an overactive imagination. But now, every creak in the walls, every gust of wind through the broken windows, felt like a threat. The first thing I noticed was how frequently the doors began to open on their own. It wasn't just the pediatric wing anymore. No, now every night, without fail, doors across the hospital would creak open, just enough to let the cool air of the hallway slip in. He'd walk by, glancing inside rooms that had been long abandoned, only to see nothing. But each time, it felt like something had just been there, something watching me, waiting for me to leave. The lights above flickered more often. The hum of the fluorescent bulbs would drop to a low buzz, and then they'd flicker out entirely, leaving the hallway dimly lit by the emergency lights. It felt as if the darkness was alive, breathing, expanding with every passing moment. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the pediatric room, the thing that had been standing there, so still and silent. But it wasn't just the lights or the doors. No, this was more than that. A week passed before it happened again. I was on my rounds, checking the hospital rooms when I heard it, footsteps. Not from behind me. Not from a room I had just walked past. No, these footsteps were coming from inside the room. I stopped. My heart skipped a beat. I had just passed that room, and there had been no one inside it when I did. I waited for a moment, my eyes locked on the room's door. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, but this time they were followed by a soft rustling sound, like something dragging against the floor. I didn't move. I couldn't. I felt rooted to the spot, frozen in place. The noise continued for another few seconds before it stopped completely. I should have walked away. I should have kept my distance. But instead, I found myself reaching for the handle, slowly turning it until it clicked open. Inside, there was no one. But the bed was in a different position than before, and the rustling sound. It seemed to come from the other side of the room. I stepped further inside, eyes scanning the corners, but still, nothing. I backed out slowly, heart pounding. I didn't tell anyone about the footsteps. Luis, however, seemed to know something had changed. One evening, as I was getting ready for my shift, he pulled me aside. His face was tight, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "You've been in there again, haven't you?" he asked. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "I told you," Luis continued, his voice low. "I told you that you shouldn't have gone in. It's never just one thing. It gets worse." I didn't think it would. "It gets worse," he repeated, more firmly this time. "And once it knows you're paying attention, it won't stop. It'll make sure you can't ignore it." I felt a cold lump form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked. Luis swallowed. "Have you noticed the sound? The whispers in the walls? The feeling that there's something behind you?" I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. Luis took a breath, eyes darting around nervously. "It's not just one thing, man. It's them." I frowned. "Them?" "The ones who never left. They're stuck here. And when you start to listen, when you start to pay attention, they begin to notice you too. And then they'll start to get closer." I felt a chill run down my spine as his words settled over me. From that moment on, things started happening more frequently. The doors would open and close on their own with increasing regularity. I could feel the temperature drop suddenly in the middle of my shift, the chill settling on my skin like a weight. At first, it wasn't so bad. I'd walk into a room, see the door open, and tell myself it was just the winds or the heating system messing up. But every time I passed the rooms, the feeling of being watched would intensify. The oppressive atmosphere made it hard to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. And then there was the mirror. I had finished my rounds in the surgical ward and was heading to the break room for a quick rest when I noticed the mirror in the hallway bathroom. I hadn't paid it much attention before, but now it caught my eye. Something was off. The reflection in the mirror was distorted. For a moment, I thought it was just the low light, or maybe my tired eyes playing tricks on me. But as I looked closer, I realized the reflection wasn't quite right. It was like a warped version of reality, as if something was shifting just out of view. I moved closer, staring into the glass, trying to make sense of it. And then, a figure appeared. I couldn't tell if it was a person or a shadow, but for a brief moment, I saw the outline of a face, eyes wide, staring directly back at me. I stumbled backward, the breath catching in my throat. I turned away quickly, hands shaking, my mind racing. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and headed straight for the pediatric wing. I had avoided it for days now, but I had to face it. I wasn't alone. Luis had followed me. He didn't say anything, but I knew what he was thinking. He had to see it for himself. We moved cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, making long shadows on the walls. The hallways were eerily silent, every footstep echoing off the sterile walls. When we reached the pediatric wing, we found the door open again. I felt my stomach drop. Luis turned to me, his face pale. I told you. They're waiting. We stepped inside, moving quietly, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The temperature was colder here, the air thicker, like it was charged with something I couldn't explain. We didn't talk as we moved deeper into the room. We both knew what we were looking for. That's when we saw it. In the corner of the room, just barely visible, was a small shadow, almost imperceptible against the walls. It was the figure again. This time, it was clearer. Not a person, but something else entirely, shapeless, its edges flickering like a static screen. And then, it moved. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tension had been building for weeks. Every night felt like it could be the one when the thing behind the walls would finally make its move. I had grown accustomed to the creaking doors, the chilling drafts, the flickering lights, but none of it prepared me for what happened that night. Luis and I had spent every shift together, working in silence. There were unspoken rules now. We stayed out of certain areas, avoided looking too closely at mirrors, and never lingered in the hallways when we heard the strange sounds. It was a survival instinct more than anything else. The hospital was no longer a place of work. It had become a haunting, and we were its unwilling residents. But tonight was different. It started with a phone call, an odd, muffled voice on the other end. I answered it half-heartedly, already used to receiving calls about misplaced records or patient updates. "Hello?" I asked, my voice tight with exhaustion. There was a pause, followed by a deep, raspy breath. "It's coming for you." I froze. The voice was familiar, but it was hard to place. It sounded almost like someone from the past. The line went dead before I could ask more. My heart pounded in my chest. I felt a cold, icy chill crawl up my spine. Luis was standing nearby, looking at me with raised eyebrows. "What's wrong?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I glanced at the phone, but there was no trace of the caller. No number. No clue as to where it had come from. I should have left right then. But deep down, I knew that whatever was coming, whatever had been creeping in the shadows of the hospital, was already here. As the night wore on, everything became more intense. The hospital seemed to grow darker, the lights dimming and flickering with an almost deliberate pace. Each time the lights went out, the silence that followed felt suffocating. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, my eyes darting to the corners of the rooms as I walked by. The doors, the ones that used to open and close on their own, were now locked. I tried the handles, finding them cold and unyielding. Something had changed. Then it happened. I had just checked the pediatric wing again, walking through the hallway, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't know why I was drawn back to this part of the hospital. I should have stayed away, but something pulled me toward it, like a magnet I couldn't resist. As I walked past the old nursery room, I noticed something different. The door was open. It was a small thing, a seemingly harmless detail. But my heart rate spiked, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam trembling as I scanned the room. The room was still. Nothing was out of place. Yet the air was thick, too thick, like it was charged with static. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound. At first, I thought it was a groan, maybe from the old pipes in the building. But as I listened, I realized it wasn't from the pipes at all. The sound was coming from the walls. It was faint, almost like breathing, but not normal breathing. A slow, labored intake of air, like something that had been suffocating for a long time and was finally drawing in its first breath. I stepped backward, my breath quickening, but I couldn't stop myself from moving toward the sound. I reached the far corner of the room, where the breathing seemed the loudest. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The sound stopped abruptly. I stood frozen, staring at the dark corner, willing my mind to stay rational. But then, the wall bulged. I saw it, clear as day, a shape pressing against the surface, as if something was trying to force its way out from the inside. The wall groaned, shifting under an unseen weight. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had before, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't look back, didn't stop to check if Luis was behind me. I just needed to get out, to escape the suffocating atmosphere that was closing in on me. I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, but before I could call Luis, I heard his voice. "I heard it too," he said, his voice shaking. I turned, expecting to see him standing in the hallway, but there was only darkness. Luis' voice came again, this time from behind me. "It's not just here. It's everywhere." I spun around, and there he was, but something was wrong. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. But his body was wrong. It was as if the shadow of something else had fallen over him. His movements were jerky, unnatural. And his voice? It no longer sounded like Luis. It sounded like someone or something else. I stumbled backward, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature, no, it wasn't Luis, stepped closer, its twisted face a reflection of something darker, something that had once been human, but was now something else entirely. Its lips curled into a grin. "We've been waiting for you." I could feel my body seize up, my legs refusing to move as it reached out to grab me. But before it could touch me, something pulled it back, a force stronger than any human hand, dragging the creature back into the shadows. The darkness seemed to swirl, to move with purpose, and I realized the truth. The hospital, this place was alive, and it was feeding on us. Luis, what was left of him, was gone. The thing that had taken his place was nothing but a shell, an imitation of the person I had once known. It had wanted me to know. It had wanted me to see it. To know that nothing here was what it seemed. The walls, the rooms, the very floors of this hospital were nothing more than a trap, a hunting ground for whatever had taken root inside. I thought I saw the faint outline of someone familiar, standing at the end of the hallway, but as I blinked, they were gone. This was the end. And yet, it had only just begun. After the encounter with Luis, what was left of him, I couldn't trust anything I saw or heard. The walls felt as though they were pressing in on me, the air thick with the same oppressive atmosphere that had been building for weeks. But I couldn't just stay here. I couldn't let the place win. The part of me that still felt human, still had some shred of fight left, told me I had to leave. But could I? Luis' body, the real one, the one I had known, was nowhere to be found. The thing that had worn his face, that had twisted his movements into something grotesque, had disappeared back into the shadows. I didn't know if it was gone for good, or if it was still waiting for me, watching from the dark corners of the hospital. I was alone now. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the hallways, not daring to look back. The lights flickered and dimmed again, casting long, terrifying shadows that seemed to stretch and grow. Every door, every window felt like a trap. No matter where I turned, it felt like I was being herded towards something I couldn't escape. I reached the exit, the doors that had always been just a few steps away from freedom. But as I reached for the handle, it was as if the hospital itself had closed its grip around me. The door wouldn't open. The metal was cold under my fingertips, and it felt almost as if the building had a pulse, a steady thrum beneath the surface, like it was breathing with me, waiting. I slammed my shoulder into the door, trying to break through, but it didn't budge. It was locked. I ran down the hall toward the emergency stairwell. Maybe I could get out that way. My only thought was to escape, to run far away from whatever haunted this place. But the closer I got to the stairs, the more oppressive the air became. The sound of my footsteps echoed too loudly, the walls closing in with every step. And then I saw it. At the end of the hall, the elevator doors opened on their own. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone around for hours. The elevator had always been unreliable, shoddy maintenance, always on the fritz. But now it stood open, beckoning me. I didn't want to get closer, but something was pulling me. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the flashlight in my hand. A cold gust of air pushed through the corridor, and the doors of the elevator creaked open further. I took a step forward, then another. The elevator was empty, yet something didn't feel right. The sudden flash of light filled the small, confined space. It was like stepping into a vision. The walls of the elevator seemed to pulse as though they were alive, breathing in rhythm with my own quickened pulse. And for just a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a fleeting shape, standing at the far side of the elevator, grinning at me. Without thinking, I turned and ran. My legs were unsteady beneath me, but I pushed forward, the sound of my breath filling my ears. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't face whatever was waiting for me. The hospital was alive, and it was playing with me. I could feel it. The walls weren't just made of bricks and mortar. They were built from something else, something darker. As I reached the stairs and ran down the first few flights, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, but I refused to look back. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. By the time I reached the ground floor, I felt like I was about to collapse. My legs were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But there was no time to rest. I had to get out. I stumbled toward the main doors again, desperate for escape. But the closer I got, the heavier the air became. It was as though the building itself was fighting me, resisting my every move. The doors were closed again, no longer locked, but sealed shut. I pushed and pulled, but they wouldn't budge. Panic gripped me. And then, as if the hospital had been waiting for me to understand, it made its move. The walls in front of me rippled, the plaster shifting as though the building was alive, flexing like muscles stretching. It was happening again. The shadow I had seen earlier appeared, but this time it wasn't just a fleeting figure. It was real. I stood frozen, my heart racing. My mind was screaming for me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. The shadow began to take shape, solidifying into the grotesque form of Luis, or rather, what was left of him. His eyes were hollow, his face a twisted reflection of the man I had known. His body was hunched and misshapen, as if he were being molded into something unnatural. The creature, whatever it was, stared at me with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was hunger, or maybe it was something worse. It opened its mouth, but the words that came out weren't Louis' voice. It was the voice of the hospital itself. You can never leave. I don't know how I made it out of the hospital that night. I don't know what I saw, or if it was real. The next morning, the building was just a building again. No more shadows, no more whispers in the walls. The lights worked, the doors opened, and everything seemed to be fine. I left. I didn't look back. But when I finally stepped outside, I could still feel the weight of the hospital on my shoulders. The air was fresh, the sky clear, but I felt the oppressive presence of the place lingering with me, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I don't know if anyone will believe me, but I know one thing for sure. That hospital wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me. And I don't think it will ever let me go. The days following my escape felt like a strange, unsettling blur. No matter how hard I tried to shake off the feeling, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. It wasn't just the hospital I couldn't shake off. It was the presence. That unexplainable, suffocating weight that had followed me from the moment I stepped foot inside. I left the city soon after. Packed up, left my job, and never spoke of it to anyone. What could I say? How could I explain that the hospital, the one that had looked so ordinary to the rest of the world, had been a living nightmare? No one would understand, and even if they did, I knew they'd never believe me. So, I kept my silence. I tried to live a normal life after that, moved to a small town, found a quiet place to stay. It was peaceful at first. The air was fresh, and the town felt safe in a way that the city never had. I thought I could finally leave behind the memories that still haunted me, the images of Luis and the shadows, the way the walls had seemed to bend and flex, the way the hospital had breathed with me. I thought I could move on. But then, the dreams started. At first, they were subtle, faint images that seemed to drift in and out of my mind. Faces I didn't recognize, rooms that felt familiar yet foreign, corridors that twisted in impossible directions. But as the weeks went by, the dreams grew more vivid. The same dark, oppressive atmosphere. The same sense of being watched, trapped in a place that was not quite real, not quite a memory, and not quite a dream. One night, the dream became clearer. I saw myself standing in front of the hospital again, the doors wide open, waiting for me. I could feel the cold draft in the air, hear the eerie hum of the building's lights flickering, as if calling me back. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding. But even in the stillness of my new home, I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. I began to question, had I really left the hospital behind, or had it never really let me go? I thought about the shadow I'd seen at the elevator, the way it had been alive in a way that no ordinary creature could be. The thing that had once been Luis, the shape that had worn his face, it wasn't just haunting the hospital. The hospital had become part of it, part of something ancient, something that could never die. And then came the visit. I was sitting at my kitchen table, late one night, staring at the quiet street outside. There was a knock at the door. At first, I didn't answer. It was late, and I didn't recognize the sound of footsteps on my porch. But the knocking didn't stop. It continued, rhythmic and insistent. I opened the door, hesitantly. No one was there. Just a small envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, stained with what looked like ink, but the words were clear. They were simple. "Come back, we're waiting for you." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but somehow it felt like a message I was meant to receive. Like the hospital had found me again, even in this quiet town, even after I thought I had escaped. The hospital wasn't done with me. I couldn't understand it. I had left. I had survived. But it was clear now. The hospital wasn't a place. It wasn't just a building. It was an entity. And it wanted me. I burned the letter. I locked every door, every window, and I stayed inside for days. I refused to let the outside world in. But the feeling never left. I'm not sure if it'll ever be free. The nightmares haven't stopped. The whispers in the walls, the cold breath on the back of my neck, they've become a part of me now. I hear the building calling me in my sleep, beckoning me to return. The question I keep asking myself is whether I will ever be able to resist. Some nights, I sit by the window, staring into the dark, and I swear I can see the silhouette of the hospital just over the horizon. It's out there, still waiting for me. And I know that sooner or later, I will have to face it again. Let me set the scene for you. It was late October. The air had a crisp bite to it, and there was a heavy fog that lingered over the town like a shroud. I had been traveling across the country, looking for a place to lay my head for the night. And that's when I stumbled across it, the old hotel sitting on the edge of the highway, a place that didn't look like it had seen a visitor in decades. It was an oddity among the more modern, lively hotels around the area, but something about it caught my attention. I wasn't expecting much. After all, it was a roadside hotel, and most of those are hardly glamorous. The sign outside was worn, the lights dim, and the parking lot only had a few cars, most of them parked in places that looked like they hadn't moved in days. The whole place had an aura of neglect, but I didn't care. I was tired, and it was getting late. Inside, the lobby was dimly lit, with dark wood paneling that gave the space an almost antique feel. A single receptionist sat behind the desk, an older woman who looked like she'd been working there for as long as the hotel had existed. She was polite, but distant, barely looking up from the book she was reading as I approached. "One night," I said, handing over my ID and credit card. "Room 7, she muttered, sliding me the key without a smile. She didn't offer much in terms of direction, just pointed vaguely toward a hallway that stretched out before me. I thanked her and took the key, not thinking much of it. I just wanted to get to my room and get some sleep. The hotel had an old-fashioned charm, with its worn carpets and the musty smell of something that hadn't been touched in years. But I didn't mind. In fact, it felt strangely comforting. As I walked toward my room, I passed by a few other guests. They were a mix of individuals, all keeping to themselves, as if they were trying to avoid eye contact. It wasn't anything too unusual, but the atmosphere was starting to feel a little off. Maybe it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me, but the quiet seemed too heavy, too suffocating. Room 7 wasn't anything special. A single bed, a nightstand, an old lamp that flickered a little when I turned it on. The curtains were drawn tight, blocking out the faint glow of streetlights from outside. I dropped my bag on the bed and stretched out, feeling the weight of travel lift off my shoulders. There was no need to explore any further. It was late, and I was tired. As I lay there in the dim light of the room, I tried to shake off the sense of unease that seemed to cling to the air. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the isolation of the hotel, or maybe it was just the fatigue. Either way, I was too tired to worry about it. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and soon I drifted off to sleep, the faint hum of the heater in the corner lulling me into a dreamless rest. But as I slept, something strange began to stir. Something that would make this hotel stay far more memorable than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know, this quiet, unassuming place would soon reveal itself to be far more sinister than I could ever have guessed. The night passed without much of a stir, but when I woke up the next morning, something felt different. The hotel room had a strange stillness to it, like the world outside had paused. I glanced around, noting the light spilling in through the small gap between the curtains, the quiet hum of the heater, and the distant sound of a car passing by on the highway. Everything seemed normal, too normal, in fact. But there was an odd, lingering sensation that something was just out of place, like a note that had been played off key, but barely noticeable. I tried to shake off the feeling as I got out of bed, stretching and making my way to the bathroom to freshen up. The hotel's bathroom was small, with cracked tiles and a mirror that looked like it had seen better days. I turned on the faucet, washing my face and staring into the reflection. There was something in the way the light hit my face that made me uneasy, like I was being watched, though I knew there was no one else in the room. I forced myself to snap out of it. It had been a long trip, and I was just tired. There was no reason to get worked up over something so trivial. But as I went to grab my things and prepare to leave, something caught my attention. The door to the room, which I had clearly locked when I arrived, was slightly ajar. Just a crack, enough to let a sliver of light spill into the room. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. Had I left it like that when I entered last night? I couldn't remember. Maybe I'd been distracted or tired and hadn't properly locked it. But it didn't feel right. It felt like someone had been in the room while I was asleep. I walked over to the door cautiously, pushing it open all the way. The hallway outside was just as quiet as it had been when I arrived. No sounds, no movement, just the eerie calm of an old building in the middle of nowhere. I checked the rest of the room to make sure nothing was out of place. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the feeling of being watched persisted, and that nagging sense that something was wrong grew stronger. I tried to brush it off as just my overactive imagination. Maybe the door had simply been left ajar by the cleaning staff, though it didn't make sense for them to have been there so early. The only other explanation was that I had made the mistake myself, but even that didn't sit well with me. Why couldn't I remember locking it? I left the room and made my way down the hallway to check out. The woman behind the desk was still there, but this time she looked up at me with a strange expression. Her eyes seemed distant, almost as if she were looking through me rather than at me. "Checking out already?" she asked, her voice flat and lifeless. "Yeah," I said, trying to shake off the unease that had crept over me. "Just passing through." She nodded slowly, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. No smile, no small talk, just a curt nod and the sound of the keys clinking together as she processed my checkout. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door, but just as I reached the exit, I heard a soft sound behind me, a shuffle of feet, faint but clear. I turned around, half expecting to see someone walking toward me, but the lobby was empty, save for the receptionist. No other guests, no staff, nothing. It was as though the sound had come from nowhere. I shook my head and told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was an old hotel, and old buildings creaked and groaned, especially ones that had been around as long as this one. I stepped out into the cool morning air, breathing in the fresh air as I approached my car. I tossed my bag into the back seat and started the engine, eager to leave the unsettling atmosphere behind me. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left it. There was something about that hotel, about the way the door had been ajar, about the strange silence in the lobby, that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just a feeling, it was an instinct, a warning. It wasn't until I was well on my way down the highway, miles away from the hotel, that I noticed it, a small, folded piece of paper on the passenger seat, tucked neatly between the seat and the door. It was the kind of thing that should have been impossible to miss, especially since I had driven away with the seat completely empty. My heart skipped a beat as I pulled the car over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I unfolded the paper. The handwriting was odd, scraggly, hurried, as if written in a rush. It simply read, "Don't go back." The words sent a chill through me. I looked around the inside of my car, as if expecting someone to be hiding in the back seat, but there was no one. No one but me, and the growing feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I threw the paper onto the passenger seat and slammed the door shut, my mind racing. I had to go back. I had to. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the pull. Something in that hotel had stirred up something in me, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the strange occurrences, the door left ajar, the eerie silence. Or maybe it was the note. Whatever it was, it felt like a sign, like a warning that I wasn't supposed to ignore. I didn't know what awaited me, but I felt I needed to know. I had to find out what was going on, what the hotel was hiding. There was something there, something lurking beneath the surface, and I wasn't about to let it go without a fight. I turned the car around, heading back to the hotel. I drove back to the hotel in a daze, my mind swirling with a mix of dread and curiosity. The note was still there, lying on the passenger seat. "Don't go back." Each time I looked at it, my gut twisted. Yet I couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at me, the feeling that something was calling me back. It wasn't just fear, though, it was something more primal. A compulsion, a drive to uncover whatever secrets the hotel held. When I pulled up to the entrance, I noticed that the once pristine parking lot now seemed darker, as if the shadows clung to the corners more than usual. The hotel stood before me like an old, forgotten sentinel, its windows darkened, its facade worn with the years. There was no sign of life around it, not even a car in the lot. It felt abandoned, yet there was a strange energy in the air, a heaviness that I couldn't shake off. I parked the car and hesitated for a moment, my fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what I was doing here. What had drawn me back? What was this force that I couldn't resist? And why couldn't I let it go? I shut off the engine and stepped out into the cool air, the ground beneath my feet feeling uneven, as though the earth itself was shifting. The same eerie stillness enveloped me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I walked toward the entrance slowly, almost cautiously, as if waiting for something to happen. The door opened with an unsettling creak, and I stepped into the dimly lit lobby once again. The receptionist was there, still behind the counter, but this time her expression had changed. Her face seemed more rigid, more controlled, as though she were waiting for something or someone. Her eyes met mine, but there was no recognition in them, just a cold, indifferent stare. "Back again?" she asked, her voice as monotone as ever. I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. "Yeah, I forgot something." She didn't respond, simply turning her gaze back to the front desk. No smile, no acknowledgement of my return. It was as if I wasn't even there. I walked past her, heading toward the hallway that led to my room. The floorboards creaked under my weight, their sounds amplified by the silence that hung in the air. I felt the weight of the walls around me, like they were closing in, their old wood and plaster groaning under some unseen pressure. When I reached my room, I hesitated before opening the door. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the empty, lifeless hallway stretching out before me. I opened the door to my room slowly, stepping inside and scanning the space with cautious eyes. Everything looked the same as it had the night before. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the unease in my chest grew stronger. I closed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes immediately went to the small window by the bed, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The light outside was fading, the sun setting over the horizon, casting an orange glow that made the shadows in the room stretch unnaturally long. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt a growing sense of dread as the evening crept in. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. The air was thick with it, pressing down on me from all sides. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the mundane, my phone, my bags, the TV in the corner of the room. But it was like the walls themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something to happen. I decided to take a walk outside, to clear my head and try to shake off the feeling that had been gnawing at me since it arrived. Maybe a breath of fresh air would help. But when I stepped outside, I found myself standing in front of the hotel, looking up at the darkening sky. The streetlights were flickering, their weak yellow glow casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the silence around me was deafening. No cars passed by, no sounds of life, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. It was then that I noticed something. There was a faint sound coming from the building, a low hum, almost like a whisper, coming from within the hotel. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, vibrating in the air. I couldn't place where it was coming from, but it felt like it was coming from deep inside the building, from beneath the floorboards, from within the very walls themselves. I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as if it were drawing closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away from the entrance, my gaze fixed on the dark hotel. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I had to get away from there. But just as I turned to leave, the front door of the hotel slammed open. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, my eyes widening in shock. The receptionist stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stared at me, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the building, and the sound of the hum grew louder, as if the entire hotel was vibrating with a strange energy. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, my body frozen in place. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, watching as the hotel seemed to pulse with something dark and unnatural, something that I had no way of understanding. The receptionist's figure appeared once again at the window, her face now pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror. She mouthed something, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, with a jolt, the lights in the hotel flickered and went out, plunging the building into darkness. I felt the ground beneath me tremble, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. I couldn't stay there any longer. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I fled from the hotel, not looking back. The hum in the air followed me, echoing in my ears, a constant reminder of the terror I had just witnessed. I had to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. Something was waiting for me inside that hotel. Something I wasn't meant to understand. I didn't sleep that night. There was no way I could. The image of the receptionist's terrified face, pressed against the window, kept replaying in my mind. The door slamming shut with such force, the hum of the hotel filling the air with something ominous. It was all too much. It was as if I had unleashed something by returning, something that had been waiting for years, maybe even decades, to be seen. And now, there was no going back. I couldn't get that sound out of my head. It echoed in my ears, like an insistent whisper, urging me to do something, to uncover the truth hidden beneath the walls of that cursed hotel. I should have left. I knew I should have. But something, some twisted force, kept me tethered to that place. The next morning, I returned to the hotel. I didn't want to. I wasn't ready. But the sense of urgency in my chest was overwhelming. I needed to know what was happening, why everything felt wrong. And so, against my better judgment, I found myself standing at the threshold of that dark building once more, the door creaking open as though inviting me in. The lobby was empty when I entered. The receptionist was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, my breath shallow, eyes scanning every corner of the space. The walls, the floors, they felt different now. I could sense the weight of something ancient, something that had been building for years. It was as if the hotel itself had been waiting for me, waiting for the right moment to reveal its truth. I moved cautiously down the hallway toward my room, the familiar creak of the floorboards echoing through the stillness. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though I was walking through some unseen force, a pressure in the air that was growing stronger with every inch I covered. When I reached my door, I paused. For a moment, I considered turning back, running away, and never looking back. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly, my fingers trembling as I grasped the handle. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was thick, heavy, as though the room itself was pressing in on me. The oppressive weight settled over me like a blanket, suffocating me with its presence. I didn't know what to expect, but it certainly wasn't the sight that greeted me. The room had changed. The bed, the furniture, all of it was the same, but there was something else, something I couldn't place. The walls, once a dull, faded color, were now streaked with dark, almost black marks, as if something had been scratching at them. The wallpaper peeled in places, revealing something beneath, a faint, jagged pattern that looked almost like writing. And the smell, it was different too. The musty scent had been replaced by something sharper, something metallic, like the tang of blood in the air. I walked further into the room, my feet dragging, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hand reached for the light switch, but before I could turn it on, I froze. Something moved. In the far corner of the room, something stirred. It was a figure at first. It was just a silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I could make out the shape of a person. A woman, or at least what appeared to be a woman, standing motionless in the corner of the room. Her back was to me, her head bowed. She didn't move. She didn't speak. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away. A part of me wanted to run, but another part of me, the part that had brought me here, urged me to stay. And then she turned. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth hung open, as though she were about to speak, but no sound came out. Her skin was paper thin, stretched taut over her bones, and her clothes were torn, as if she had been trapped in this room for years. My heart raced in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as fear gripped me. I didn't know what she was or why she was there, but I knew one thing: she was not human. I took a step backward, my body trembling with a mix of terror and disbelief. The woman raised her hand slowly, pointing directly at me. Her fingers were long and bony, the nails cracked and yellow. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were cold, as though they had been spoken by something far older than any human. They sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. Before I could respond, the room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the lights flickered, and the floor beneath me seemed to sink. The entire hotel felt like it was moving, shifting, as if it were alive. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps, but there was nowhere to go. The door had closed behind me, and I couldn't see any way out. The woman took a step toward me, her face twisted in an expression of both sadness and malice. "You're too late," she said, her voice echoing in the room, growing louder and louder. "It's already begun." The temperature in the room dropped, the air growing frigid, biting into my skin like ice. I could see my breath, fogging in front of me, as the woman's form began to distort. Her body stretched and twisted, her limbs elongating, her face contorting into something inhuman. My chest tightened, and the fear that had been building for days reached its peak. I was trapped. There was no escape. I had been brought here for a reason, and now I was going to pay the price. I turned to run, but the room seemed to warp and twist around me. The walls closed in, and the doors slammed shut, as though some unseen force was keeping me inside. My heart pounded in my chest, my body shaking with fear as I fought to breathe, to think, to escape. But there was no way out. The woman's voice filled my mind, an unrelenting whisper that told me everything I needed to know. "You were never meant to leave. You're part of it now. You're part of the hotel." And then, in that moment, I understood. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a place where lost souls were trapped, never to escape. And I was now one of them. As the woman reached for me, her cold hand brushing against my skin, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke, I was back outside, lying on the cold pavement, the hotel looming behind me like a dark, oppressive shadow. I don't know how I got there. I don't know how I survived. But one thing was certain: I couldn't go back. The hotel had claimed me, and now it would never let me go. And the worst part, I could feel its presence, always lurking just beyond the edges of my awareness, waiting for the next victim to come through its doors. The events of that night, the hotel, the woman, the dark, suffocating presence, felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I still wasn't sure what had happened. What I had seen wasn't something I could easily explain away. I felt disconnected from reality, as if the world around me was somehow hollow, unreal. But there I was, lying outside in the cold, staring at the looming hotel, unable to bring myself to get up. My body ached, and my head throbbed with confusion. The realization hit me like a wave. I was free, physically at least. I was no longer trapped in that room. The hotel's grip on me had loosened for the time being. But I didn't feel safe. My senses were on edge, as if I was being watched, followed. I scrambled to my feet, pushing myself away from the pavement, my legs weak beneath me. I had to leave before the hotel claimed me again. I turned around, my heart pounding as I glanced over my shoulder, as if expecting to see the woman's ghostly face staring back at me from the hotel window. But there was nothing, just the same crumbling facade that had greeted me when I first arrived. The doors closed tight, the windows dark and still. But I wasn't convinced it was over. Nothing about this felt finished. I stumbled down the street, my mind racing, trying to process everything. My breath came in shallow gasps, and every step seemed to echo in the empty night. The cold air bit at my skin, sharp and unforgiving, but it was nothing compared to the chill in my bones. There was a heavy weight pressing down on me, the weight of the curse that still lingered. It was like a dark cloud that hovered over me, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake it off. The entire town seemed deserted, as if it too had been touched by the hotel's dark influence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I was alone, and yet I didn't feel alone. I felt watched. I found myself at a small diner on the edge of town. It was late, and the place was empty except for a lone waitress behind the counter. She glanced up as I entered, her tired eyes taking in my disheveled appearance. But she didn't say anything, just nodded as I walked toward an empty booth and slumped down, exhausted. I ordered coffee, something to ground me, to keep my thoughts focused. I needed clarity. I needed to understand. The waitress brought my cup and then retreated to the other side of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I took a sip, the hot liquid burning my throat. It didn't help. My mind was a whirlpool of confusion and dread. The woman in the hotel, her voice, the look on her face, it was all still too vivid. What did she mean by part of it? The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over, growing louder with each passing second. I couldn't make sense of it. And then it hit me. I had gone to the hotel looking for answers, but I wasn't prepared for what I had uncovered. The truth was far darker than I had imagined, far more twisted. I had walked into a place that existed outside of normal space, a place that twisted reality itself. The hotel was a prison, yes, but it was also something more. It was a doorway, a link to something ancient and malevolent. I had felt it, hadn't I? That oppressive presence. It had almost consumed me. But I had escaped, at least for now. But how long would that last? The waitress came back and refilled my cup, her eyes meeting mine for a brief moment. I caught a glimpse of something in her gaze, something that stopped my heart for a second. It was fear. The same fear I had seen in the receptionist's eyes, the same fear I had felt creeping up my spine. "Are you all right, hun?" she asked, her voice soft but strained. I nodded, forcing a smile, but it felt hollow. "Just a bad night," I said, my voice distant, as if I were speaking to someone who wasn't there. "I'll be fine." She didn't press further, but the way she looked at me made it clear that she knew something. She had seen it before. She had lived it, probably more times than she cared to admit. I couldn't stay there. I had to leave. I couldn't be in that town any longer, couldn't be anywhere near the hotel. It felt like it was calling to me, like I was being pulled back into its orbit. I pushed my cup aside and stood, walking toward the door with shaky legs. As I stepped outside, the cool night air hit me, but it didn't feel as cold as it had before. I began walking again, but this time I didn't have a destination in mind. I just walked, with no real purpose except to distance myself from the hotel, from the town, from everything that had happened. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to leave. Hours passed. I walked through the quiet streets, past empty houses and darkened shops. The town felt abandoned, as if it were part of the hotel's curse, as though the presence had spread beyond the building and infected everything around it. It wasn't just the hotel. It was the town, the people, everything. Eventually, I found myself standing by the edge of the forest, looking out at the trees that stretched out before me. It was a familiar sight, one I had known for years. But tonight, it felt different. The forest wasn't just a place of nature anymore. It was part of the curse. The air felt heavier here, thick with the same oppressive energy that had haunted the hotel. I could feel it then, an unmistakable presence, just beyond the trees, watching me, waiting. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't. The fear in my chest was nearly overwhelming. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I hadn't truly escaped. The hotel's grip on me wasn't gone. It was still there, lurking, stretching its tendrils into every part of my life. I couldn't run from it. I couldn't hide from it. No matter how far I went, no matter where I tried to go, the hotel would always find me. It had claimed me the moment I stepped through its doors, and it wouldn't let me go. As I turned and walked away, I couldn't help but look back one last time. In the distance, through the trees, I saw a flicker of movement. The woman's face appeared in the window of the hotel, her cold eyes staring directly at me. I couldn't escape. The hotel had me now, and there was nothing I could do to get away. But I would never stop running. That was the only thing I had left. The days following that night were a blur. I kept running, physically and mentally. Every street, every turn, every fleeting glance at my reflection seemed to pull me deeper into the nightmare. There was no peace, no solace. The hotel was always there in my mind, just beyond the edge of my thoughts. Even when I slept, I didn't truly rest. The woman's cold eyes and the oppressive atmosphere of the hotel haunted me, following me into every dream, every shadow. I couldn't escape. But then, one day, I stopped running. I had been running for so long, searching for answers, trying to outrun something that seemed inescapable. But the more I ran, the more it chased me. The harder I tried to flee, the tighter its grip became. I realized that, no matter how far I went, I could never truly outrun it. And so, I stood still. I let the fear wash over me, let it settle into my bones. I had no other choice. There was nothing left to do. I returned to the town, to the hotel. I had to face it, confront whatever dark force had taken hold of me. The hotel stood there like a silent sentinel, waiting for me, its facade unchanged, its windows dark and still. It seemed to mock me, as though it had always been there, as though it had always been waiting for me to come back. The door creaked open when I approached it. The air inside was stale, thick with the same heavy energy that I had felt before. It was like stepping into a different world, a world where time didn't exist, where the normal laws of reality were suspended. The hallway stretched out before me, its shadows deep and endless. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel the same dread that I had before. I walked down the hall, each step echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel the temperature dropping, the chill seeping into my bones. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I reached the door to my old room, the room where everything had begun. The door opened with a groan, and I stepped inside. It was just as I remembered it, dimly lit, the furniture worn and forgotten, the same eerie quiet hanging in the air. But then I saw it. The woman. She was standing by the window, her back to me, staring out at the dark sky. I couldn't see her face, but I knew it was her. I could feel her presence in the room, like a weight pressing down on me. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly approached her, every step filled with dread. "Why?" I whispered, the question slipping from my lips before I could stop it. She didn't answer at first. She just stood there, still as a statue, her long dark hair flowing around her. Then, slowly, she turned to face me, her cold eyes locking with mine. "You've always been a part of it," she said, her voice soft, almost sympathetic. "It's in you now. It's always been in you." I couldn't breathe. The words were like a knife, cutting through me, stripping away any hope I had left. I wanted to run, to leave, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. "What do you mean?" I choked out, my voice trembling. The woman smiled, a cold, hollow smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You're not free. You never were. The hotel, the town, the curse, it's all one. And now, you're part of it. There's no escaping. Not for you, not for anyone who comes here." I wanted to scream, to lash out, but all I could do was stand there, frozen. The weight of her words was crushing. "Why me?" I asked, the question slipping out in a hoarse whisper. "Because you were always meant to be here," she replied. "This place." It's built on souls. It's built on those who are willing to sacrifice themselves to its power. And now, you're one of them. The room seemed to tilt, spinning around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air suffocating. I could hear the distant sound of whispers, the same whispers that had haunted me all this time. I backed away slowly, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with those cold, dead eyes. And then, something changed. The room seemed to shift, the darkness growing deeper, more oppressive. The walls seemed to melt away, and the hotel itself felt alive, pulsing with energy. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape her. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. But when I opened them again, everything was gone. The hotel was empty. The woman was gone. The room was silent once more. I was alone. But the feeling remained, the feeling that I was still trapped, that I had never really left. The woman's words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over. "You're part of it." I couldn't escape. I would never escape. And the worst part, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Maybe, in some twisted way, I had always belonged to the hotel. Maybe the hotel had always belonged to me. Maybe we were one, bound together in a never-ending cycle, forever entwined. And so, I walked away, but not really, because the hotel was still with me, and always would be. Its grip on me was not one of chains, but of something far more subtle. It was inside me now. It had become a part of me, as much a part of my life as anything else. I would live with that knowledge, the knowledge that I was forever tied to the hotel, forever bound to its curse. There was no escape, and there never would be. Now, let me take you to a place that's as eerie as it is real. This story isn't one you'll hear told at a campfire. It's one that happened to me, and I'm sure it will stick with you long after the video ends. It all started a few years ago. I was driving back home late one night, heading down a quiet country road that I'd traveled 100 times before. It was a road I knew like the back of my hand. In fact, I had spent years driving on it, weaving in and out of its winding corners, past overgrown fields and abandoned homes that looked like they'd been forgotten by time itself. It was the kind of road that felt comforting, like something you could rely on, especially after a long day of work. But that night was different. It was late, around 1 a.m., the kind of hour when the world seems to hold its breath, and the usual hum of the city was a distant memory. I remember the eerie quiet as I turned onto the road. There weren't even the usual sounds of animals or wind. Just the steady hum of my car's engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires. The road stretched for miles, but there was something about it that night that felt off. The trees that lined the sides of the road seemed taller than usual, their shadows stretching long across the asphalt like dark fingers reaching out to grab me. Maybe it was just the time of night, or maybe it was the lack of any other cars on the road, but I felt an odd chill creep up my spine. I didn't think much of it at first. I thought maybe I was just tired, or that the isolation of the road was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Something had changed on that stretch of road. Let me give you a little context here. This road had always been a part of my life. I had grown up nearby, and it was where my friends and I would drive around after school, talking about anything and everything. Over time, it became familiar, comfortable even, like an old friend. I wasn't the only one who found comfort in it. I had spent hours listening to the stories of locals who told tales about the road. Some said it was haunted. Others said it had a strange aura about it, but no one had concrete evidence of anything unnatural. And yet, I knew something wasn't quite right when I saw it. The signpost up ahead, the one that had always been there, wasn't. Instead, there was just a weathered wooden post. The kind of post that looked like it had been there for decades. No sign, no name. It was as though it had been deliberately erased from existence. I slowed down, staring at it for a few moments before I shook my head and muttered to myself, "Must be a prank or something." But as I drove further, my car headlights flickered, casting strange shadows along the road. At first, I thought it was just an issue with my car's electrical system. After all, it wasn't the newest model, and I had been meaning to take it in for maintenance. But the flickering grew more erratic, and I could hear a faint buzzing sound that seemed to be coming from the engine. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the beginning of a series of events that would make me question everything I knew about that road. It wasn't just a quiet, deserted stretch of country road anymore. It had become something else, a place where the ordinary laws of nature didn't apply. And little did I know, I was about to find out exactly what kind of place it had turned into. I pressed on, telling myself it was nothing. After all, I had driven this road countless times before. I was familiar with every curve, every bump in the road, every creaking bridge. It had always been a peaceful part of my life. But that night was different. The farther I drove, the more I felt it, the unmistakable sense that I wasn't alone. That feeling that creeps up on you when you think someone is watching, when you turn around and see nothing, but something is still there, just beyond your vision. At that moment, I should have turned around. I should have made a U-turn and gone home, but I didn't. I kept driving. And then, it happened. A flash of light, no, a shadow, darted across the road ahead of me. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something. But when I slammed on the brakes, there was nothing there. Not even a trace. I sat there for a long moment, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. But I didn't turn around. I didn't know why I stayed on that road, but I did. It wasn't until later that night, when I finally arrived home, that I realized how truly strange things had gotten. And what it felt on that road was only the beginning. It was the next day when the weirdness really started to sink in. At first, I tried to push it all out of my mind, figuring maybe I was just overtired from the long hours at work, or that the darkness of the road had played tricks on me. The mind has a funny way of doing that, doesn't it? Making the simplest of things seem out of place, just because of a few unsettling moments. But that night, as I sat down for dinner in the quiet of my home, I felt that same unease creeping in again. It started with a simple knock at my door. At first, I wasn't sure who it could be. It was a little late for visitors, and the only people who ever came by unannounced were my neighbors, who never knocked, just walked in. But this time, the knock was urgent. 3 sharp taps. I stood up and moved toward the door, my feet heavy. Something in my gut told me I wasn't going to like what I'd find on the other side. I opened the door, and there was no one. Not a single person in sight. I looked down at the ground, expecting maybe a note or something, but there was nothing. Just the same old porch steps leading down to the empty driveway. I almost convinced myself that it was nothing. Maybe some kids messing around or a random passerby. But as I closed the door and locked it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, I went back to work, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous night and the strange feeling that seemed to follow me around everywhere. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, life has a funny way of making you second-guess your thoughts, especially when everything seems fine on the surface. But as the day went on, I found myself remembering something I hadn't thought about in years. The old stories that people used to tell about the road. There were the rumors of strange noises at night, of car engines dying for no reason, of people disappearing only to show up days later, disoriented, claiming they couldn't remember what had happened to them. It all seemed so far-fetched when I was younger. But now, with that strange encounter on the road still fresh in my mind, those stories felt too real. That evening, I decided to drive down the road again. I don't know why I thought it would help, but I had this compulsion to go back. I figured I'd drive down the familiar path, reassure myself that everything was fine, and let the feeling of normalcy return. As I got in my car and started the engine, I noticed that it was quieter than usual. I don't mean in the way that country roads are quiet. This was oppressive silence. My tires rolling over the gravel sounded louder than ever before, and the air itself felt heavy, almost suffocating. I passed the spot where I had seen the strange flash of light the previous night, but it wasn't the same. The trees lining the road were no longer just dark shapes against the sky. They looked wrong. There was an unnatural stillness to them, as though they were frozen in time. And as I looked out the side window, I thought I saw movement, just a glimpse, but enough to make me slam on the brakes. My heart raced in my chest as I pulled over to the side of the road, my fingers white-knuckling the steering wheel. But there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing out of the ordinary. "Come on," I muttered to myself. "You're just being paranoid. It's just trees and shadows. That's all." But as I sat there in the car, my eyes scanning the edges of the road, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was someone coming up behind my car, maybe a hitchhiker or someone needing help. But as I turned around to look out the rearview mirror, I saw nothing. There was no one there. The footsteps had stopped. And yet, the sound lingered in the air, as if someone was right beside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I started the car and sped down the road, my foot pressing harder on the gas pedal with each passing second. But the faster I drove, the more I noticed the world around me blurring. The trees, the road, the headlights, all merging together in a distorted, unnatural way. It felt like the road itself was closing in on me, like I was being swallowed by it. When I finally reached the end of the road, I pulled into a small parking lot at a local convenience store. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. I needed a moment to clear my head. But as I stepped out of the car, something caught my eye. There was something on the ground near the curb, something small, shiny. It was a piece of metal, maybe a broken car part or a discarded tool. But as I bent down to pick it up, I realized it wasn't a piece of metal at all. It was a coin. The strange thing, it wasn't a coin from any country I knew. It was old, weathered, and had symbols I didn't recognize. The more I looked at it, the more it felt wrong, like it didn't belong. My fingers trembled as I tossed it back on the ground and stepped away from it. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat, my mind racing. What was going on? Why had everything felt so off? And what was that coin? My thoughts were spiraling, but something inside me urged me to leave the road behind. to never drive down it again. But I couldn't. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to it, like there was something I needed to understand. I had to go back, even though every instinct in me screamed to stay away. As I drove home that night, the air seemed to thicken again, the quiet pressing in on me. And deep down, I knew something wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The next few days after my encounter on the road felt like a blur. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but underneath, there was this constant hum of unease, like the air itself had changed. It wasn't just the road anymore. It was everything. I began to notice subtle things in my everyday life, things that I hadn't paid attention to before. Objects that seemed out of place, people who gave me odd looks, the faintest sound in the background, barely noticeable, but always there. It was as if the world had shifted slightly off its axis, and nothing felt solid anymore. I kept driving down that road, despite my better judgment. Something in me couldn't resist it. Each night, I'd find myself drawn back, almost like I was being beckoned. I would tell myself that I was just getting paranoid. It was just my mind playing tricks. But as the days wore on, I realized that this was no longer about the road. It was something far bigger, something deeper. It started with the shadows. At first, I thought it was nothing, a trick of the light, maybe. But then they started to move on their own. The way the trees stretched across the road at night, they cast these long, twisting shadows that seemed to shift, even when there was no wind. The first time I noticed it, I was driving slowly down the road, and I saw a shadow flicker in my peripheral vision. I thought it was just a car passing behind me, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, there was nothing. That was when I began to pay attention. I wasn't just seeing shadows move in the corner of my eyes. I was hearing things too. Soft whispers that seemed to drift in from the darkness, carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was just the trees rustling, but when the whispers started to get louder, more distinct, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was something else, something deliberate. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was going on, so one night I grabbed a flashlight, determined to get to the bottom of it. I parked my car at the same convenience store, the usual place it'd stop before heading down the road. The lights in the store flickered as I entered, and the air was thick, like there was a storm coming, even though the sky was clear. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced at me, his eyes fixed on the small television screen. He didn't even say anything when I walked by. That was odd in itself. Usually, he'd greet me with a half-hearted smile, but tonight, he was just there, like he was waiting for something. As I walked to the back of the store, I noticed the shelves seemed emptier than usual. It wasn't just the food aisles either. The air felt wrong, like everything had been drained of its color, its life. I stepped outside and walked toward the road, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The shadows on the trees seemed even more pronounced tonight. They stretched far across the road, twisting in unnatural shapes, and for a moment I felt a shiver run down my spine. The usual quiet of the place had turned into something unsettling. There were no crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence, an eerie, dead silence. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the annoying fear in my chest. "It's just your mind playing tricks," I muttered to myself. But even as I said the words, they felt hollow, like I was trying to convince myself of something that I already knew wasn't true. I continued down the road, my flashlight beam sweeping from side to side. As I passed the spot where it first felt the unsettling presence, the air grew thicker. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped and turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Only the empty stretch of road, the trees, and the shadows that seemed to grow longer with every passing second. That's when I heard it. A soft shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the ground. It came from behind me. Slowly, I turned around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart was pounding in my chest. I flashed the light toward the sound, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees. Just for a moment. Then it was gone, slipping back into the darkness before I could make out any details. I rushed back to the car, my breath coming in quick gasps. I started the engine with shaking hands, the roar of the engine feeling strangely loud in the silence of the night. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the road was empty, just like it had been every other time. But it wasn't the same. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every flicker of the lights, every gust of wind outside made my heart race. I kept seeing flashes of that figure in the corner of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of those eyes watching me. And the whispers, faint and distant, were still there, floating just beyond the edges of my consciousness. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination, stirred up by the stress. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The next day, things only got worse. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could hardly breathe without feeling like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in my chest. I had to get answers, and the only way to do that was to go back to the road, to face whatever it was head on. But as I walked to my car, I noticed something strange. There were fresh tire tracks leading up to my driveway. That wasn't unusual in itself. People came and went all the time, but these tracks were different. They were too deep, too deliberate. It was as if someone had been circling my house, waiting for something. Waiting for me. I hesitated. I didn't want to go back down that road. I didn't want to face whatever was out there. But I knew I had no choice. The road had already become part of my life now, whether I liked it or not. And whatever was lurking in the darkness wasn't going to let me go so easily. I got in my car and drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The road seemed longer this time, the trees looming overhead like giants. And as I drove deeper into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Something that wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. I was beginning to wonder if I was the one who was being hunted. It wasn't long before I hit the point of no return. I could feel it creeping closer with every passing mile, the weight of something sinister closing in around me. The road, that abandoned stretch of asphalt that had once felt so familiar, now seemed like the mouth of some unseen beast, ready to swallow me whole. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the fear I felt was simply the result of my own overactive imagination. But as I drove further into the darkness, that small voice of doubt in the back of my mind grew louder. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone for days. I knew it now, in the deepest part of me. The lights of my car were the only thing that cut through the night, throwing long, eerie shadows that danced and swayed in the trees along the side of the road. I could feel the air around me growing colder, the temperature dropping with every passing minute, as if the very atmosphere was aware of my presence and didn't like it. It happened without warning. The engine sputtered. For a moment, I thought it was just a glitch. Maybe I hadn't been paying attention, or maybe it was just the nerves getting to me. But no, the engine cut out completely, and the car rolled to a stop. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel in frustration, cursing under my breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now, not here. The car refused to start again. No matter how many times I turned the key, it remained silent. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead as the silence settled over me. The engine's failure felt like more than a mechanical issue. It felt like a warning. And deep down, I knew that if I didn't do something, anything, I wouldn't make it out of this place. Not alive, at least. I grabbed my flashlight, hoping it might offer some semblance of safety in this madness. The beam flickered uncertainly as I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into my skin like needles. My breath hung in the air, visible in the dim light. I glanced around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing except the trees and the dark, oppressive sky above me. I tried to keep calm, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I had that same feeling again, the feeling that something was watching me. Something unseen. I could hear the faintest sound, footsteps, maybe, coming from the woods beside me. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the trees, their branches twisting and bending in the wind, groaning under the weight of their own twisted forms. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a voice. A low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from the very earth itself. It wasn't a whisper, not in the way you might imagine. It was something deeper, something far more sinister. The sound sent a chill through my entire body. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. It wasn't in a language I could understand. It sounded almost ancient, like something old, something that had been buried in this place long before I was even born. Panic began to take root in my chest. I tried to run back to the car, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. The voice continued to echo through the trees, growing more insistent with every passing second. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. I could only feel the terror rising inside me, the pressure building in my chest like a vice. And then I saw it. A figure! At first, it was just a shadow, barely noticeable in the dim light. But then it emerged from the trees, stepping into the beam of my flashlight. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body thin and elongated, like a twisted version of a person. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, those eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything except stare at it, my body frozen in place by some unseen force. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me with those empty eyes. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, deep into my soul, as if it was searching for something within me, something it could claim for itself. A sound, a soft, raspy breath, escaped its mouth, and it took a single step forward. My instincts kicked in then, and I bolted. My legs screamed in protest as I ran back to the car, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The woods around me seemed to come alive, the trees closing in, their branches reaching out like fingers trying to grab hold of me. The voice grew louder now, more frantic, as if it was calling to me, urging me to come closer. But I wasn't going to give in. Not this time. I reached the car, fumbling with the door handle, my hands slick with sweat. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. I finally yanked open the door and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't wait. I didn't look back. I just started the engine, desperate to get away. The car roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding down the road without a second thought. The trees on either side of me blurred as I raced down the asphalt, the sound of my tires screeching against the road filling my ears. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. The air was thick with something I couldn't see, something just beyond my reach. And then I saw it again. The creature. It was standing in the middle of the road, its silhouette illuminated by the headlights. I couldn't stop. My foot pressed harder on the gas, and I swerved to avoid it, my heart in my throat. But just as I passed by, I could feel its presence. It was there, just behind me, watching me. I didn't dare look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, where the road turned into something familiar. Safe. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling. The creature was still there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting, watching. And for the first time, I realized that I might never be free of it. By the time I reached the edge of town, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. The grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, my body drenched in sweat. My heart was still hammering in my chest, each beat louder than the last. It was as if my entire body had been plunged into some kind of chaotic, relentless state. I parked the car at a gas station, my mind spinning with everything that had happened, everything I had seen. I couldn't rationalize it. It didn't make sense. But no matter how hard I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, I knew. I knew what I saw, what I felt. It wasn't just a dream or a hallucination. The thing, whatever it was real. I sat there for a long time, not sure what to do next. The night had wrapped itself tightly around the town, but the streets felt quiet. Far too quiet for my liking. My head throbbed, and I couldn't shake the vision of those dark, empty eyes staring at me, watching me as I fled. I couldn't forget the fear that had gripped me, the overwhelming sensation that something dark, something malevolent, was still following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. At some point, I finally worked up the nerve to leave the car. I needed to clear my head, to process everything. I walked through the gas station, nodding absently at the attendant, but there was no real acknowledgement between us. It wasn't as if I could talk about what had happened. How could I? People wouldn't understand. They would think I was losing my mind. I passed through the town in a haze, moving mechanically as I tried to come to terms with what I had just experienced. But every corner I turned, every quiet street, felt like a trap. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as though something was watching me, even here, even now. I tried to find solace in the mundane, in the normal rhythm of life, but the truth was that nothing felt normal anymore. Nothing felt safe. When I finally arrived at my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch. My hands were still trembling, my mind racing with images of the creature and the voice that had echoed in the woods. I was certain of one thing now. This wasn't just some random encounter. It wasn't an isolated incident. Whatever had been out there on that road wasn't done with me. I could feel it. I sat there for what felt like hours, lost in thought. It seemed pointless to try and explain what had happened to anyone. How do you even begin to describe something like that? And yet, deep down, I knew I couldn't just leave it behind. I couldn't pretend it didn't happen. The truth was, there were too many questions that remained unanswered. Why was the creature there? What did it want? What did it mean? I thought about the road, the one I had driven down so many times before, the road that now felt like a graveyard of lost memories. I didn't think it was just the road itself that was cursed. It was something deeper, something tied to that place, to those woods. I couldn't ignore the fact that I had felt it long before the creature appeared. It had been watching me long before I realized it. There was something wrong about that road, about the land around it. The question that haunted me was whether or not I was truly free from whatever I had encountered. It felt like a question without an answer. The days that followed were filled with anxiety, with paranoia that clung to me like a shadow. I tried to return to my routine, to pretend that everything was fine, but the weight of it lingered. Every car ride was a reminder of the night I had almost lost everything. Every time I walked down a quiet street or through an empty neighborhood, I couldn't help but feel the presence of something watching me, waiting for me to slip up. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the road, more out of a need for answers than anything else. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe some kind of sign that I wasn't crazy, or perhaps to prove that I wasn't the only one who had seen what I had. I wasn't sure if I was searching for closure or something more sinister. But the road was different now. It wasn't just empty. It was abandoned in every sense of the word. There was no trace of the creature, no sign of the terror that had unfolded. Only the lingering sensation that something was missing, something was wrong. I spoke to locals who had lived there for years. Some of them knew about the road, but none of them spoke of it in any detail. Most people ignored it entirely, as if the memory of it was something best left forgotten. A few even seemed uneasy when I asked, as though they had known something was wrong for a long time, but didn't want to acknowledge it. In the end, I didn't find answers. I never will. The road still stands as a reminder of that night, and I sometimes wonder if it's waiting for someone else, someone more foolish or desperate than I was, to cross its path. As for me, I don't go near it anymore. The months that followed that harrowing experience felt like a blur. It was as if the world was moving in slow motion while I remained stuck in time, haunted by the shadow of what had happened. Despite my attempts to carry on with life, to pretend like everything was normal, I knew deep down that it would never be the same. Something in me had changed, irrevocably. Even now, as I sit in the quiet of my apartment, the unsettling silence feels oppressive. The mundane hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards only serve as reminders of the absence of peace I once took for granted. I can't shake the thought that whatever it was I encountered that night, whatever dark presence lingered on that abandoned road, has never truly left me. It's almost as if it has imprinted itself on my very soul, leaving behind a permanent mark, a scar that won't heal. I've tried to move on. I've tried to forget, but I can't. The things I saw, the things I felt, are too real to simply dismiss. I've come to terms with the fact that I may never fully understand what happened. There are just some mysteries in life that can't be solved, and sometimes it's better not to know. It's funny how life keeps moving forward, even when you don't feel like you're part of it anymore. People around me have no idea what I've been through, and in a way, I envy them. They go about their lives without the constant weight of that knowledge, without the ever-present feeling that something is lurking just beyond the corner of their vision. They don't hear the faint whispers in the wind or feel the chill on their spine when they walk alone at night. But I do. I've tried to find peace in the fact that I'm still here, that I survived whatever that was. But that doesn't change the fact that part of me is still back there, on that road. Part of me will always be trapped in that moment, struggling to understand what was real and what wasn't. It's a fight I don't think he'll ever win. The hardest part is the fear that one day it will all come back. Maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe it's already begun. It's hard to tell anymore. I've learned to live with the anxiety, with the unsettling feeling that I'm being watched, but I can't escape it. I don't know what it wants or why it followed me, but I feel as though I'm still somehow connected to it. Maybe it's just a part of me now, woven into the fabric of who I am. In the quiet moments, when I'm alone and my thoughts wander, I sometimes hear it again. The voice. I can't place it, but I know it's there. Sometimes it feels like it's calling to me, beckoning me back to that road. But I won't go back. Not now, not ever. I've lived through something that no one should have to endure. I've seen the unknown, and it has changed me forever. There's a part of me that wants to forget, to move on and put it all behind me. But then there's another part, one that knows I can't ignore the truth. The truth that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that go beyond our understanding. And I'll never forget what I saw. I've come to terms with it, in a way. I don't know if it'll ever find peace, but I've learned to accept the fact that some things are simply beyond our control. Life goes on, and we have no choice but to keep moving forward. But that road, that haunted, abandoned stretch of asphalt, it's never really gone. It's always there, just beneath the surface of my mind. And so, I live with it. I live with the knowledge that, somewhere out there, it's waiting for the next person to come across its path, waiting for the next soul to wander too close. And maybe, just maybe, I'll be ready when it comes again. Now, I want to take you back to a time when everything seemed perfectly normal. Life was simple, predictable, and comfortable. I never expected to be telling you this story today, not because it wasn't real, but because at the time, I couldn't quite grasp the reality of what was happening. It's easy to push strange events aside when they happen in a place you trust, a place you've walked through 1,000 times without a second thought. But sometimes, when you least expect it, that trust gets shaken to its very core. It all started one summer, a time when everything felt like it was moving in a straight line. The weather was warm, the days long, and the nights were calm, almost too calm. I had always been the outdoors type, the kind of person who enjoys the stillness of the woods, the rustling of leaves, and the gentle sway of trees under the breeze. It wasn't unusual for me to take a walk through the forest near my house. It was a small patch of wilderness just a few miles out, tucked away behind a cluster of houses. Nothing special about it, really. I wasn't seeking adventure, I just enjoyed the solitude and the sense of quiet that only a forest could offer. This particular forest, though, had an air about it, a weight that I didn't realize until much later. But on this day, I was just looking for peace. It was a Saturday afternoon, the sun hanging lazily in the sky, and I decided to take a walk alone. I wasn't planning on going too deep into the trees, just a quick trip, a break from the chaos of my daily life. It was a habit of mine to walk these paths whenever I needed to clear my head. I didn't think anything of it that day. Little did I know, that would be the last time it experienced this forest the same way again. I remember the faint smell of pine needles in the air as I stepped into the woods. The ground was soft beneath my boots, a mix of dirt and old leaves that crunched underfoot. I had my usual route, a winding path that led to a small clearing near a creek. It was peaceful, serene, a spot where the sun filtered through the trees and made the leaves shimmer like gold. It was my escape from everything, my sanctuary from the noise of the world. At that time, the world felt far away. As I walked, I noticed something strange. I couldn't quite place it at first, but the usual sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the scurrying of animals, were missing. The forest felt too quiet, unnervingly still. I brushed it off as just my imagination. After all, it was a hot afternoon, and maybe the wildlife was just taking shelter from the heat. But there was a certain heaviness in the air that I couldn't ignore. I've never been one to believe in superstitions, and yet this feeling crept over me like an itch I couldn't scratch. After walking for about 20 minutes, I reached the clearing. The small creek gurgled softly, the water running clear over the rocks. Everything looked just as it always had, but there was something different. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I didn't know what it was, but it felt as if the forest was watching me. This is when I met the first person I would ever see in this place. As I was standing by the creek, lost in thought, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was just someone else out for a walk, but as they stepped closer, I realized there was something strange about them. They moved too silently, their footsteps barely making a sound on the forest floor. I couldn't make out their face clearly. They were wearing a hood, their features hidden in the shadows of the trees. I remember thinking that it was odd, but I didn't immediately feel any fear. In fact, I felt a strange sense of curiosity. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was just the eerie calm of the place, but something about them felt out of place. "Hey," I called out, breaking the silence. "You lost or something?" The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, unmoving. I waited for what seemed like a few moments, but it felt longer. When they finally turned to walk away, I noticed they didn't move like someone walking through a forest. Their steps were too deliberate, too smooth. They didn't seem to be stepping on the ground at all. That's when the unease truly started to settle in. I should have turned around and left right then, but instead, I watched them disappear into the trees. Shaking it off, I tried to ignore the strange feeling creeping over me. I figured they were just someone out for a solitary walk like I was. But I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, as if something might be there, watching me. This was the beginning, though I didn't know it at the time. It wasn't long after the encounter with the hooded figure that I began to sense something truly off about the forest. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, but the more time I spent there, the more my instincts screamed at me to leave. I would return to that forest many more times in the days that followed, and with each visit, the unsettling feeling it experienced before seemed to deepen. I remember the first time I noticed something strange. It was a few days after the encounter with the figure on a Wednesday afternoon. The weather had been clear, and I decided to take another walk through the forest, just as I had done countless times before. This time, though, I wasn't alone. My friend, Jordan, had come along with me. Jordan and I had been friends for years, and we shared a similar love for the outdoors. He was someone who enjoyed the quiet, the solitude, and the simplicity of the woods, just like me. We met up at my house and decided to take the same path I had taken on that Saturday. As we walked, we chatted casually about everything and nothing. The sunlight filtered through the trees, and for a moment, everything seemed completely normal, like it had been before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the deeper we went into the woods, the more I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere. As we walked along the familiar trail, I noticed something odd. There were no animals. The birds weren't singing, the squirrels weren't darting across the path, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. It was as though nature itself had gone still. Normally, you'd hear the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, or the scurrying of critters. But this time, there was nothing. The silence was deafening, oppressive. I mentioned it to Jordan, half joking. "Hey, this place is really quiet today. Almost like it's holding its breath." He looked around, squinting into the trees. "Yeah, now that you mention it, it's kind of weird. I don't like it. Where's all the wildlife? It's like they just vanished." His words sent a chill down my spine. The more we talked about it, the more aware we became of just how unnatural the silence was. We walked on, but the sense of unease continued to grow, creeping into the edges of my mind. We continued down the familiar path, but when we reached the small clearing near the creek, things took a turn. We stood there for a moment, taking in the peaceful scene, but it didn't feel peaceful. Not anymore. It felt wrong. There was a heavy weight in the air, and the trees around us looked darker. The sunlight that had been filtering through the branches seemed to be dimming, as if it were being swallowed by the forest itself. The creek, usually clear and calm, now seemed to have a murky quality to it, the water flowing sluggishly over the rocks. I could see Jordan eyeing the trees nervously. "You feel that, right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's like something's off. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't like it." It was then that we both heard it, something that sent a chill through my bones. It was a faint sound, almost like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the sound of animals moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps grew louder, more distinct, and it was clear that they weren't coming from any animal. These were the deliberate, rhythmic steps of a person. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Jordan's eyes widened, and he glanced around, trying to locate the source of the noise. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice rising in both fear and confusion. There was no answer. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs felt frozen. The footsteps continued, but they seemed to be circling around us, getting closer and closer. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The silence returned, even more oppressive than before. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us moving, too afraid to speak. Finally, I found my voice, though it was shaky. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, we turned and started walking back along the trail, trying to keep our pace steady, but our minds were racing. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end, as if someone or something was watching us from the trees. We didn't say anything to each other for the rest of the walk. We didn't need to. We both knew something wasn't right, and neither of us wanted to acknowledge it, but the fear was undeniable. As we neared the edge of the forest, I glanced back one last time, my heart still pounding in my chest. The woods behind us were dark and silent, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. The footsteps had stopped, but the uneasy feeling remained, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. When we finally made it out of the forest, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Jordan didn't say a word, but I could tell by the look on his face that he felt the same way. We didn't speak about what had happened, not right away. But the events of that afternoon stayed with us, lingering in our minds long after we left the woods behind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. The footsteps, the eerie silence, the feeling of being watched, it all gnawed at me. But what bothered me the most was how real it all felt. The sensation of being followed, of something or someone there in the trees, just out of sight. It wasn't the kind of fear that fades after a while. It was a deep, primal fear, one that sat in the pit of my stomach and refused to leave. The next day, I couldn't get the events out of my head. I knew I had to go back. Something about that forest, that place, was pulling me in, and I couldn't ignore it. But I wasn't going alone this time. Jordan and I made plans to return together, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could figure out what was happening in those woods. The thought of facing whatever was out there terrified me, but I knew we had no choice. The forest had already left its mark on us, and we couldn't just walk away without understanding why. And that was only the beginning. Little did I know, what awaited us in those woods was far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The following days felt like they stretched on forever. I couldn't shake the eerie sensation that had taken hold of me after that afternoon in the forest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows of the trees, the murky creek, and heard the faint echo of those footsteps. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop wondering what it all meant. I had to know what was happening. Jordan was just as unsettled as I was. We didn't speak about the events directly, but we both felt the weight of that lingering fear in the air. It was as if the forest was calling to us, pulling us back, urging us to uncover whatever was hidden beneath its dark canopy. We couldn't ignore it anymore, so we made plans to return. This time, we would be more prepared. We'd bring flashlights, a camera, and anything else that might help us understand what was going on. Whatever it wasn't just some figment of our imagination. It was real. The next afternoon, we set out again, with a sense of determination mixed with dread. The weather was overcast, and the usual warmth of the sun had been replaced by a chill in the air. It wasn't cold, but there was something about the atmosphere that felt unnatural, stale, heavy, like the air itself had stopped moving. We didn't say much as we walked back toward the forest, but the unspoken tension between us was palpable. I could feel Jordan's nervous energy, and I was sure he could feel mine as well. As we approached the edge of the forest, the trees loomed before us like silent sentinels, their thick trunks casting long shadows across the ground. The forest seemed unchanged, but I knew better. There was something different this time. It was as if the woods were waiting for us, aware of our return. We stepped into the familiar trail, and the sensation of being watched hit me almost immediately. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the silence around us was oppressive. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd expect from nature, peaceful, calming. No, this was something else entirely. It was heavy, like it had been hanging in the forest for years, waiting for the right moment to break free. We walked in silence for a while, each of us lost in our thoughts. The further we ventured into the woods, the more unnerving it became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, and every so often, a twig would snap under our boots, the sound too loud in the otherwise quiet forest. And then it started again. The feeling of being watched. I tried to shake it off, but it was impossible. I could feel eyes on me, following my every move, even though I couldn't see anyone. It was as though something was lurking just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I looked over at Jordan, and he was staring straight ahead, his face pale. He looked just as unsettled as I felt. We stopped for a moment, standing in the middle of the path. Neither of us spoke, but we both knew what we were feeling. Something wasn't right. Something was out there, and we were in its domain. "That's it," Jordan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not crazy, right? You feel that too?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, I feel it. It's like something's in here with us. Watching." We stood there for a few moments, both of us scanning the trees, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Not a rustle in the leaves, not a distant bird call. The forest was still, too still. "Let's keep going," I said, though my voice trembled. "We have to figure out what's going on. I can't keep feeling like this." Reluctantly, Jordan agreed, and we continued down the path. We walked for what felt like hours, our footsteps echoing in the silent woods. But as we neared the clearing by the creek, the atmosphere seemed to change once again. It wasn't just the stillness that bothered me this time, it was the smell. There was a strange, metallic scent in the air, almost like iron, but sharper. It made my stomach churn, and I could see Jordan wrinkle his nose as well, clearly sensing the same thing. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "Yeah, what is that?" "It doesn't smell like anything I've ever smelled before." We moved closer to the clearing, our eyes scanning the area, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The creek was still sluggish, its water dark and murky. The trees around us towered above, their thick trunks casting long shadows over the ground. But there was something off about the way the shadows moved, almost as if they were shifting, stretching unnaturally. And then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, we heard it, a low, guttural growl. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our breathing, but it grew louder, more distinct. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Jordan didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward the trail. We began to walk faster, our steps quickening as the growl grew louder, closer. It was as though whatever was making that sound was getting closer, following us. We reached the edge of the forest, the trees parting just enough to let the daylight in, and the growl stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was suffocating, but there was something else in the air now, an undeniable presence, something that didn't belong. "What the hell was that?" Jordan asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. "But I don't want to stick around to find out." We didn't look back as we hurried out of the woods. The sensation of being watched was unbearable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just behind us, waiting for us to turn around. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark shadows of the trees, the murky creek, and I could hear that growl echoing in my mind. I had to go back. I had to know what was happening in those woods. But as much as I tried to convince myself that I was in control, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I was in way over my head. The forest had become a place of fear, a place where the rules of reality didn't seem to apply. And the more I tried to understand it, the more the forest seemed to pull me in, drawing me deeper into its dark heart. Whatever was there, I knew it was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The following day, Jordan and I couldn't ignore the pull of the forest. We both knew that whatever was happening there, whatever we had experienced so far, wasn't something that would simply disappear. It was something far bigger than us, and we couldn't leave it alone. We had to find answers. We returned to the woods with a sense of dread and determination. But this time, we weren't walking down the familiar path. We veered off the beaten trail, following the tree line deeper into the unknown. The air had thickened since the last time, heavier and more suffocating. The trees pressed in around us, their trunks gnarled and twisted, like the bones of some ancient, forgotten creature. The further we went, the more we could feel the oppressive weight of the forest around us. It wasn't just the feeling of being watched anymore. It was as though the very trees were alive, breathing, shifting with every step we took. The silence wasn't quiet anymore, it was loud. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt amplified, like the forest was waiting for something to happen. "Do you feel that?" Jordan whispered, his voice tight. I didn't answer immediately. I couldn't. I was too focused on what lay ahead. But I felt it. The air had shifted again. There was a distinct vibration in the ground beneath my boots, a low hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The tension was so thick now that I could hardly breathe. We moved forward slowly, cautiously, but with each step, it became harder to ignore the unsettling feeling that grew stronger with every passing minute. The trees were thick and twisted, their branches reaching out like claws, and the shadows seemed to stretch further, deeper, with every turn. And then we saw it a clearing up ahead. The same place where we had seen the strange shadows before. But now there was something else. Something far worse. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a large stone circle, ancient and covered in moss. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, their jagged edges worn smooth by time, as if they had been there for centuries. A low mist curled around the stones, swirling in unnatural patterns. The growl we had heard the previous day echoed from the depths of the woods again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. The feeling in the air had changed. It wasn't just oppressive anymore, it was suffocating. My heart raced, and I could feel my chest tightening, as if the forest itself was closing in on me. Something was there. Something was waiting for us. We stepped into the clearing, our eyes fixed on the stone circle, when a shape emerged from the mist. It was too fast, too sudden. A shadow, no, something far worse, darted toward us from the trees. It was humanoid in shape, but it didn't move like a person. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, as if it were part of the forest itself. Jordan froze. His eyes locked on the figure, and for a split second, I thought he was going to fall to his knees. I could see the fear in his eyes, the panic rising in his throat. But before he could react, the creature lunged at us with an ear-splitting screech, a sound so loud it felt like it was tearing through the very air. I grabbed Jordan, pulling him back, but my feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The creature's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a sickly yellow light. Its face was twisted, a grotesque mask of something human yet utterly alien. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one more monstrous than the last. We stumbled backward, terror crashing over us like a wave. The world around us seemed to warp and bend as the creature advanced, moving faster than anything I could comprehend. It was no longer just a creature. It was a force of nature, something that existed outside the realm of what we understood. With every step it took, the forest seemed to come alive around us. The trees bent and creaked as if they were reaching for us, their branches snapping like brittle bones. The air grew thick with the smell of rot and decay. It was like the forest itself was part of this creature, its body and soul intertwined in ways I couldn't even begin to understand. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and I turned, expecting to see Jordan. But it wasn't him. It was another shadow, another figure emerging from the trees. It was as if the forest was alive, alive in a way that I could never have imagined. The shadows didn't just hang in the trees anymore. They were stepping out, walking toward us, their forms shifting and flickering like flames in the wind. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my mind was frozen in place. The creature was closing in on us, and I could hear its breath, ragged, wheezing, as it approached. In that moment, everything went dark. I don't know how long we were unconscious. When I came to, I was lying on the ground at the edge of the clearing, Jordan beside me, The creature was gone, the forest was silent, and the only sound I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. We didn't speak at first. We couldn't. We just lay there, trying to process what had happened, trying to make sense of the nightmare we had just experienced. The creature, the stone circle, the shadows, it all felt like a bad dream, something that couldn't be real. But I knew deep down that it wasn't a dream. Whatever was in those woods, whatever force had been watching us, was still out there. And it wasn't done with us yet. But for now, all we could do was get out of the forest and never look back. The sun had started to set by the time we stumbled out of the forest, both of us covered in dirt, bruised, and shaken to our core. My breath was ragged, my heart still hammering in my chest. Every step felt like an eternity, but I couldn't bear the thought of looking back. The forest behind us seemed to stretch endlessly, an imposing presence that haunted the horizon. We had crossed the line, whatever it was, between the world we knew and something else. And we had left something behind in those woods, something we couldn't fully understand. But as much as we wanted answers, I knew we'd never find them. Not in a way that made sense. We didn't speak on the way home. There was nothing to say. We couldn't explain what had happened, not even to each other. We both felt the weight of the experience settle in our bones, but neither of us dared to ask the question, what if it follows us? I remember getting back to my car, standing there for a moment as the distant trees loomed over the edge of the road. Jordan was already in the passenger seat, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror, his body tense. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, but I didn't know how to ask. It felt like if I said the wrong thing, the walls of my reality might crack wide open, and the nightmare would come spilling back into our lives. We drove in silence, the forest fading in the rearview mirror. The hum of the engine was a small comfort compared to the stillness of the woods. But that didn't mean we were safe. The forest had already shown us that there were forces at play beyond our understanding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods had left something in me, something I couldn't escape. When we arrived at my house, I locked the doors behind us and drew the blinds. We didn't talk about it. How could we? There were no words for what we'd experienced. But I knew Jordan was as haunted by the events as I was. Neither of us slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the yellow eyes of that creature, and the low growl echoed in my ears. Days passed, and we tried to go back to our normal lives. Jordan resumed his work, and I tried to find some semblance of peace. But the forest, those woods, kept creeping into our minds. I started having dreams. Not just dreams, but nightmares. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, as if something was lurking just outside my door, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I got a call from Jordan. His voice was hoarse, distant. "I went back," he said, "to the woods." I couldn't speak. The words caught in my throat, my body suddenly cold with dread. "Jordan, no," I whispered, but he wasn't listening. "I had to know," he continued. "I thought it might be gone, but it's not." The line went dead. I tried to call him back, but there was no answer. My hands were shaking as I stared at the phone in disbelief. He couldn't have gone back. I knew what those woods did to people. Whatever force was there wasn't done with him. It wasn't done with any of us. The next morning, I found Jordan at his apartment. He didn't answer the door at first. I knocked for what felt like hours, but when he finally opened it, he was different. His eyes were empty, hollow, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't slept in days. He didn't speak. He barely even looked at me. "Jordan, what happened?" I asked, but he just shook his head. His lips trembled, but no words came out. The fear in his eyes spoke volumes. I tried to get him to talk, but it was as if the person I knew had disappeared. He was there physically, but his mind, his spirit, was somewhere else, lost in the woods. I stayed with him for hours, trying to get him to snap out of it, but nothing worked. He never said what he had seen when he went back to the forest, but I didn't need to know. I could feel it. Whatever had a hold of him was still out there, and it had found him again. Days turned into weeks, and life seemed to return to its regular pace. Jordan was never the same. He stopped showing up to work, stopped answering his phone. His apartment sat empty, abandoned, like the forest had already claimed him, piece by piece. I couldn't stop thinking about him. But even more so, I couldn't stop thinking about the creature, the stone circle, the way the forest had twisted reality itself. Something was happening out there, something bigger than just a haunting. I had no proof, no concrete explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished with us. I tried to reach out to people who might help, experts, paranormal investigators, anyone who could give me answers. But every single person I spoke to had either never heard of the place or dismissed it as an old myth. Everyone except one person, a local historian, who, after some convincing, revealed that the forest had a history of strange disappearances, of people who had wandered in and never returned, and of rumors that certain areas of the forest were cursed, or worse, alive. It was then that I realized we weren't just dealing with something that could be explained away. Whatever force we had encountered was ancient and had been there long before us, and would be there long after. The last time I saw Jordan, he was sitting on a park bench, staring into the distance with that same empty look in his eyes. He didn't even acknowledge me when I called his name. I knew then that whatever had happened to him in those woods had taken root inside him, and there was no escaping it. And me? I couldn't bring myself to go back. I couldn't risk falling into that void of madness. But I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The forest was still out there, waiting. And even though I had left, part of me would always be tied to it. The years have passed since that night. I've tried to put the memories behind me, but some things don't fade. The forest has haunted me in ways I never imagined it could, and even though the physical scars have healed, the psychological ones remain, buried under the surface like an old wound that never quite fully closes. I can't help but think back to those first moments of unease, the way everything felt so normal until it didn't. Until we stumbled upon something that couldn't be explained away, a presence that lingered in the shadows of those woods. There was no tidy explanation, no way to make sense of what happened. Some things, some places, are simply beyond understanding, and perhaps it's better that way. There are moments in life when you're confronted with the unknown, and the only thing you can do is walk away. But the question that remains is, can you ever truly walk away from it? Jordan never returned to his old self. I tried reaching out to him, but he was never the same. It was as if something inside him had broken that night, something that couldn't be mended. I can't say I blame him. The forest took something from him, maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. It left a mark that he couldn't escape. I've heard rumors of him, whispers from people who claim to have seen him wandering aimlessly, his eyes glazed over, lost in his own world. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if I want to know. As for me, I've tried to move on, but I can't forget. How could I? That forest changed me. It left me with more questions than answers, and even though I've never been back, I feel its pull every time the wind howls outside or the night seems to drag on too long. It's as if the forest knows it hasn't finished with me yet, like it's waiting for the right moment to reach out and draw me back into its depths. I've come to realize that there are places in this world where reality bends, where the rules we live by no longer apply. Some of those places are hidden in plain sight, just beyond the edge of familiarity, waiting for someone to cross the line. But once you've crossed it, once you've seen what's hidden behind the veil, you can never fully leave it behind. It will follow you, silently, relentlessly. It will wait for you to forget, and then it will remind you. And when it does, you'll know that nothing is ever truly gone. I don't go into the woods anymore. I can't. But in the quiet moments, in the dead of night, when the wind rustles through the trees outside my window, I hear it, the call of that place, that other world that exists just beneath the surface. It's a constant reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. I've learned to live with it, with the knowledge that some things are better left unexplained. The forest, the creature, the inexplicable events, it all lingers in the back of my mind, waiting for me to remember, to question, to return. But I want, not again.